It's nice to have you back in Animal Quest. Today, we're diving into the shocking incidents that prove just how quickly African safaris can turn deadly. From a man in Zimbabwe who climbed out of the vehicle for a better photo of a bull elephant, to a flooded channel in Zimbabwe where a current made a decision nobody in the water could reverse.
The afternoon of August 4th, 2018 was warm and golden over the Masai Mara in Kenya, the most famous safari country on earth. A single open vehicle sat parked a short way off, from a pride of lions in the long grass, engine idling, a guide at the wheel, and a handful of guests leaning out with their cameras. The lions lay flat and heavy in the heat, a big pride, several lionesses, and a scatter of young ones, paying the vehicle no attention at all. Deborah Lang was in the back, closest to the edge of the vehicle, and she had decided she wanted a photograph without anything at all between her lens and the cats. Deborah was 52, an American on the trip she had been dreaming about for years, and she had been a careful, easy guest all week, right up until this one afternoon. The guide had said it at the start of every single drive, the way every guide in that country says it, that the animals see the vehicle as one large harmless shape and never once count the separate people sitting inside it. And he had told them the single rule a whole safari rests on: you do not stand up above the line of the vehicle, you do not lean out of it, you do not, for any reason, get out. The pride was close that afternoon, closer than all week. The light was perfect, and the lions looked like enormous, contented house cats dozing in the sun. That is the whole trap of it. A pride at 40 or 50 feet, full and sleepy and ignoring you completely, does not look like anything to fear. And a week of exactly that had quietly taught Deborah the warnings were overblown. She wanted the shot clean, with no window and no vehicle frame in it. She asked the guide to let her lean right out, and he told her no, plainly, that the edge of the vehicle was the line and she was to stay well inside it. She waited until his attention was on the far side of the pride, put her hand on the vehicle, and stepped 1 foot down onto the ground. The guide told her no, at the start of every drive, and again in that moment. She stepped out of the vehicle anyway. The instant a person breaks the clean outline of the vehicle, the quiet arrangement falls apart. The lions no longer see one big harmless shape sitting on the track. They see a small, upright, separate thing that has suddenly appeared at close range in the middle of their afternoon. And a lion reads a thing like that as either a threat or a chance, and either way, the answer comes at once. A lion can cover 40 feet of open ground in the time it takes a startled person to get 1 foot back up into a vehicle. There is no warning growl and no slow build to it. There is only the decision made somewhere behind those eyes, and then the lion is simply there. The nearest lioness was up and moving before Deborah's foot had even properly settled onto the ground. She came low and flat and fast across the open grass, no run-up and no sound, and 2 more of the pride peeled off the ground behind her the moment the first one committed. Deborah had time to half-turn back toward the vehicle and no time at all to do anything with it. The first lioness hit her at full speed and took her down against the side of the vehicle, and the others were on her in the same breath. Inside, the guide and the guests could do nothing but watch it happen a few feet away, unable to reach her without climbing out into the same grass. The pride dragged her out and away from the vehicle into the long grass, and then a pride of lions did with what it had brought down what a pride of lions does. The killing part was over in seconds. The rest went on, out in the grass, and there was nothing a single soul in that vehicle could do but sit and know it was happening. A lion dozing by your vehicle is still a fully wild lion. It just hasn't been given a reason yet to notice you're there. The guide got the vehicle moving and the shocked guests away and radioed back to camp what had happened. Help would come, but everyone who heard the call understood it would come to recover her, not to save her. The pride had what it had taken and was not going to give it back. Wildlife authorities recorded it the way they record the handful that happen this way every year, almost always the same story, a person who left the vehicle. The lions were not touched for it, because they had done nothing that a lion does not do to a small animal that steps out of a car and into the middle of the pride. Deborah's family was reached through the embassy, and the guide, who had said no and been ignored by a guest sure she knew better, was left to carry that afternoon for the rest of his life.
It was February 8th, 2015, and the Nile corridor near Murchison Falls was deep in the transition between wet and dry seasons. The landscape was still lush, but the river had begun its annual retreat, concentrating wildlife along the shrinking banks. Hippopods that had been spread out across wide channels during the wet months were now basically crowding into whatever deep pools were left. Sigvald Brecken was a 58-year-old retired insurance broker from Bergen, Norway. He was an avid hiker who'd traveled all over the place but had never actually been to Africa before. This trip, a 2-week safari through Uganda with his wife, was a retirement gift to himself. He'd been planning it for about a year, and from everything he'd read, it was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The couple was on an afternoon-guided game drive along the Nile. Their vehicle stopped at a scenic overlook above a broad section of riverbank. It was one of those spots that looks gorgeous from up top, wide river below, green banks, birds everywhere. A wooden post and rope boundary marked the safe viewing limit. The guide reminded both of them that hippos were frequently grazing in the reeds below and weren't always visible from up top. Brecken photographed the river from behind the boundary, but the angle disappointed him. Dense reeds and a slight rise in the terrain blocked any direct view of the water's edge, where he could hear splashing and deep grunting. He noticed a narrow footpath going down the slope beyond the rope, probably worn down by local fishermen, though locals typically only used it during daylight when they could actually see into the reeds. He told his wife he was going to walk just a few meters past the line for a clear shot. She objected. The guide was on the far side of the vehicle, answering her earlier questions about bird species along the river, and did not see Brecken step over the boundary rope. The trail looked used, like clearly other people walked down there pretty regularly, and I think that's what made it feel okay to him, because if locals go down there all the time, how dangerous can it really be? Except the people who actually use that trail know exactly when the hippos are out and where they sit. He just saw a path. He descended about 30 yards down the slope along the trail. The reeds below were over 6 feet tall, basically a solid wall of green hiding everything between the slope and the water. A large hippo, estimated later at over 3,500 pounds, had been grazing in those reeds since before the vehicle even showed up. Invisible from the overlook above, the animal was now directly between Brecken and his route back up the slope. Hippos are responsible for a significant number of fatal encounters across Africa. Despite weighing up to 4,000 pounds, they can charge at speeds exceeding 20 miles per hour over short distances, and they're super reactive when startled at close range, especially near water access routes. Their massive jaws can open nearly 180 degrees, revealing canine teeth over a foot long, and their bite force exceeds 1,800 pounds per square inch, more than enough to crush bone and inflict devastating trauma. Brecken reached a small clearing in the reeds and raised his camera toward the river. The hippo, grazing less than 15 yards away, detected his presence immediately. The animal let out this explosive guttural snort that just split the quiet air. Brecken froze. The hippo emerged from the reeds at a full charge, covering the distance in a burst that gave Brecken no time to react. The jaws struck across his torso and shoulder area with enough force to cause severe internal injuries, and the hippo just continued forward over him before turning back toward the river and crashing through the reeds. The encounter appears to have unfolded extremely quickly. Brecken lay in the trampled reeds, and the injuries were catastrophic, likely unsurvivable even with rapid evacuation. His wife heard the commotion from the overlook and alerted the guide within moments. The guide descended cautiously and found Brecken in the reeds. Emergency services were contacted, but the overlook was genuinely remote, the nearest medical facility over an hour away by road. He was confirmed dead at the scene. The investigation noted that he had crossed a clearly marked boundary. The tour operator was cleared of liability. His wife was 20 yards above him when it happened, close enough to hear all of it. Too far to do a single thing. I keep trying not to picture that, and it's not working. It was September 25th, 2018, along the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida, where cargo ships and fishing vessels crossed strong Atlantic currents. That night, offshore conditions had worsened, with rough swells, strong current movement, and poor visibility after sunset. Water temperatures were warm, but smaller vessels were already struggling against unstable water before the emergency began. At around 11:40 that night, a cargo vessel crossing the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida transmitted a distress call after an explosion erupted inside the engine room during rough offshore conditions. Investigators later determined the blast occurred near part of the fuel system, igniting a fire that quickly spread below deck while seawater flooded into the lower compartments. The crew attempted to contain the damage, but the flooding overwhelmed the pumps within minutes, causing the ship to list heavily to one side. Nearby vessels initially believed the situation could still be stabilized. Cargo crews trained constantly for onboard fires and flooding emergencies, and incidents like this are sometimes controlled before abandonment becomes necessary. But the damage kept spreading. Power systems failed one after another. Smoke filled sections of the lower deck, and eventually, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship before the vessel disappeared beneath the current entirely. One of the survivors was Eris Thorne, a 28-year-old deckhand who had spent most of his adult life working Atlantic cargo routes. Co-workers described him as quiet, dependable, and unusually calm during emergencies. So when the situation unfolded that night, Eris wasn't somebody panicking through his first storm. He was used to long weeks offshore, rough conditions, and the constant exhaustion that comes with spending most of your life surrounded by open ocean. 12 crew members managed to escape onto a single inflatable life raft shortly before the ship sank. But the raft quickly became another problem. It was overloaded, overloaded. Waves constantly spilled over the sides, and sometime after midnight, one of the outer air chambers began slowly losing pressure. Every hour, the raft sank lower into the ocean. Eventually, the crew created a rotation system to reduce the weight. As the raft lost pressure, several crewmen were forced partially into the water while holding on to the exterior safety lines to keep the raft from capsizing. This is the part of the story that already feels terrifying to me, even before anything appeared beneath the surface. Imagine being forced to hang partially outside a failing raft in the middle of the open ocean because too much weight might collapse it completely. No lights, no shoreline, no visible horizon. Just black water in every direction while waves keep pushing against your body for hours. Around 2 in the morning, Aris took his turn outside the raft. By then, the Gulf Stream had gone completely dark. There was no moonlight on the water and no visible horizon, just black ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The raft rose and dropped unevenly with the swells, while salt water sprayed constantly across the survivors clinging to the sides. According to Aris later, the only thing keeping him oriented was the sound of the other men and the rope in his hands. And around the Gulf Stream off Florida, that matters. The area is home to several large shark species, especially oceanic whitetips and bull sharks, both known for investigating struggling movement near wrecks or floating debris. Most shark encounters never turn into attacks, but survivors floating low in the water, surrounded by splashing and noise from a sinking vessel, create exactly the kind of disturbance predators notice from below. At first, everything felt manageable. Then something brushed against Aris's leg. He later described it as rough, wet sandpaper sliding briefly across his skin before disappearing back into the dark. A few moments later, another crewman admitted he had felt something too. The raft was overloaded and partially deflated, leaving several survivors stuck chest-deep in the water with nowhere else to go. Then the shouting started. One crewman near the far side of the raft suddenly jerked violently backward while clawing at the safety ropes. Several survivors lunged toward him as water exploded around the struggling man. But in the darkness, nobody could clearly see what was happening beneath the surface. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the struggling stopped, and the rope slipped loose into the dark. The survivors stayed frozen against the raft, while weak flashlight beams swept uselessly across the surface. Every touch against the skin triggered panic, because nobody could tell what debris was and what was moving beneath them. Hours passed like that while the Gulf Stream carried them through total darkness. Then, shortly before sunrise, another scream erupted near the edge of the raft as part of it collapsed inward, dropping several exhausted men deeper into the water while something large continued moving below them. After that, panic spread through the raft. Nobody wanted to stay in the water longer than necessary, and every sudden movement beneath the surface made people react violently. At one point, Aris later said he felt a hard impact against his lower leg before something moved past him underwater, but he was never certain what made contact in the darkness. And honestly, this might be the worst case in the entire episode because there's literally nothing you can do. You can't see what's under you. You can't defend yourself. And every second in that water probably felt endless. For the next several hours, the survivors focused mostly on keeping the damaged raft afloat, while exhaustion and cold exposure worsened. Shortly before sunrise, part of the weakened raft finally folded inward, forcing more of the crew into direct contact with the water. Several recovered bodies later showed injuries consistent with possible shark scavenging or traumatic encounters in open water during the night. By the time rescue aircraft later reached the coordinates, several crew members were already missing or unresponsive in the water. In the aftermath, maritime authorities reviewed the vessel's safety equipment and emergency preparedness, particularly the condition of the life rafts and distress communication systems. The incident also led to stricter enforcement of overnight weather advisories for smaller fishing crews operating far from shore. Some regional operators later upgraded emergency locator beacons and required additional survival training focused on prolonged exposure in open water. Several survivors reportedly struggled with lasting psychological effects after the sinking. A few never returned to offshore fishing again, especially after describing how helpless the situation felt once they were left floating through the night. And for me, that's the part people underestimate. The ocean didn't become terrifying because they could clearly see a predator circling them. It became terrifying because they couldn't see anything at all. On March 7, 2017, near a remote creek access point in Australia's Northern Territory, 26-year-old Italian backpacker Breno Solferino entered crocodile-inhabited water after midnight, while 3 friends remained on the bank nearby. By that point, Breno had been traveling through Australia for almost 5 months. Originally from Verona, Italy, he had arrived the previous October on a standard working holiday visa and spent the following months moving through the East Coast backpacker route. Hostels, temporary jobs, long bus rides, and shared travel groups that formed and disappeared every few weeks. He had worked briefly near Cairns before eventually making his way west into Darwin by early 2017. Like most travelers moving through the Northern Territory during wet season transition, Breno was following recommendations passed between backpackers, waterfalls, swimming spots, remote campsites, and creek systems outside the city. But early March in the territory carries a very specific kind of environmental risk. The wet season had begun easing into the dry transition period, which changes crocodile movement patterns across the region. During peak flooding months, saltwater crocodiles often spread far inland through swollen river systems and overflow channels. As water levels begin dropping again, many start moving back toward permanent waterways and coastal systems. Wildlife officers across the Northern Territory had already updated warning signs at multiple swimming and creek locations in the weeks leading up to March 2017, because crocodile movement becomes less predictable during this period. The creek access point Breno and the other backpackers reached that evening had active warning signage posted at the entrance. According to later statements given by the 3 surviving travelers, the signs were impossible to miss. Investigators would later confirm that Breno himself photographed one of the warnings shortly after arriving at the site. The group stayed there overnight. They built a small fire near the creek bank, drank, talked, and remained at the site after dark. By midnight, the surrounding area had become almost completely black, apart from the firelight and occasional flashlight beams. Northern Territory waterways at night operate differently than they do during the daytime. Visibility collapses, surface movement becomes difficult to track, and crocodiles hunt most effectively in exactly those conditions. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptilian predators on Earth. Mature males can exceed 16 feet in length and weigh over 1,000 pounds. Unlike predators that rely on pursuit, crocodiles function as ambush hunters. They remain nearly motionless beneath the surface, often with little or no visible disturbance in the water, waiting for movement at the shoreline or in shallow areas. When attacks occur, they happen extremely fast. The initial strike is designed to seize and destabilize the target immediately, usually followed by violent rotational rolling, intended to disorient and submerge. In documented nighttime attacks involving deep water, survival without immediate external intervention is extremely rare. Sometime after midnight, Breno entered the creek. The other 3 backpackers stayed near the campsite and watched from the bank. Later statements described a sudden disturbance in the water near where Breno had moved out from shore. One of the group reportedly shouted toward him. Another briefly scanned the water using a flashlight. Then the surface settled again. None of the 3 entered the creek. Instead, they backed away from the shoreline and contacted emergency services. The location's remoteness, combined with darkness and difficult terrain between the access point and the nearest roadway, made an immediate nighttime rescue impossible. Northern Territory Police and wildlife rangers did not reach the area until first light the following morning. When rangers arrived, they located a large saltwater crocodile still near the site. Wildlife officers assessed the animal's behavior as consistent with recent feeding activity. Under Northern Territory protocol involving fatal crocodile attacks, the crocodile was destroyed shortly afterward. Breno Solferino's remains were partially recovered from the surrounding area. The subsequent investigation conducted by Northern Territory Police and Parks Australia concluded that the warning infrastructure at the site had been visible, compliant, and functioning correctly. The review found no failure in signage placement or public safety procedure. Breno's death was formally classified as the result of voluntarily entering a posted crocodile habitat during nighttime hours. No criminal charges were filed. No major policy changes followed the incident, although the location was later included in a broader seasonal review of crocodile warning coverage across the territory. The part that stays with me in this story is not the crocodile itself. It's the photograph of the warning sign sitting on Breno's phone, because that image means the information reached him. He saw the sign. He stopped long enough to photograph it. He processed it enough to joke about it online. And then, hours later, he walked into the water anyway. I keep thinking about how often people survive risky decisions before the one time they don't. That's usually how this pattern forms. Small warnings become background noise because nothing bad happened the last time, or the time before that, until one night in early March, at a creek in the Northern Territory, when the margin finally closes. It was May 26, 2017. The late afternoon light over a national park in northern Botswana fell long and low across the riverside plain, the kind of golden hour light that draws safari vehicles into position hours before peak activity and creates strong incentives to remain stationary, well past the point where guides begin to grow uncomfortable. The heat had begun to drop, and large numbers of elephants were moving from inland feeding areas toward the river in the well-established late-afternoon corridor pattern that the park's experienced operators knew as a fixed daily certainty. The light at that hour is extraordinary. It is also the reason vehicles stay too long and position too close. Beauty has a cost in places like this. Johan Venter was a 46-year-old safari driver from South Africa who had worked across multiple game reserves on the subcontinent and held a professional guide qualification with dangerous game endorsement. Emily Carter, 25, and Lucas Meyer, 27, were tourists from different countries who had joined a shared vehicle for the afternoon drive. The riverside track through this section of the park was a narrow single-lane road bordered on one side by dense riparian vegetation and on the other by a drainage ditch, used daily by breeding herds moving between the interior bush and the water. It was not a road designed to accommodate multiple stopped vehicles simultaneously. Several vehicles had gathered along the track during the late afternoon movement, and one positioned ahead had stopped awkwardly in a location that partially blocked passage through the corridor. Tourists across multiple vehicles had risen through roof hatches as a breeding herd began emerging from tree cover. Venter observed the nearest female displaying a clear and escalating sequence of stress indicators. Ears held rigidly outward from the skull, trunk drawn inward and curled beneath the head, repeated dust throwing from the ground surface, and a short bluff advance that stopped and reset. He began reversing his vehicle immediately. The vehicle positioned directly behind had stopped too closely, leaving insufficient room to complete the maneuver. Venter read every signal correctly. He made the right call. The vehicle behind him is the reason that call could not be executed. The female performed a mock charge, stopping approximately 10 meters from the front of the vehicle line. Several tourists in adjacent vehicles responded to the halt by continuing to photograph and film at elevated volume and movement, misreading the stop as hesitation rather than as a terminal point before a committed charge. African bush elephants are the largest land animals on Earth. Adult females in breeding herds routinely exceed 7,000 pounds, and despite the assumptions their size generates, they are capable of accelerating to speeds that no safari vehicle can outpace across the short distances typical of track encounters. The behavioral assessment of mock versus committed charge is one of the most consequential decisions a guide makes in the field, and the margin for error is narrow. A mock charge typically involves raised trunk, flared ears, and a deceleration to a stop at distance. A committed charge involves a lowered head, tucked trunk, and sustained acceleration with no stop. The transition between these two behaviors does not announce itself. It occurs within a single movement sequence. Females with calves are consistently the most dangerous individual elephants in any encounter, and their threshold for transitioning from mock to committed attack compresses significantly when their established movement corridor is blocked by vehicles positioned on multiple sides with no clear exit. The female committed to a full charge from the 10-meter position. She accelerated directly into the vehicle line without stopping and struck the front quarter panel of Venter's vehicle with sufficient force to push it partially into the drainage ditch beside the track. The vehicle sustained significant structural damage. Carter and Meyer sustained minor injuries from the impact. Venter received a laceration consistent with contact against the interior of the vehicle during the collision. Emergency radio contact was established immediately, and support reached the location within approximately 40 minutes. The investigation confirmed that the incident resulted from a combination of vehicle clustering on a narrow single-lane corridor, inadequate spacing maintained by the vehicle to the rear that prevented the guide from executing a safe withdrawal, and continued high-movement behavior by tourists in adjacent vehicles during an active threat display by the herd's lead female. Venter was assessed as having responded correctly throughout the sequence and was cleared of any negligence. The Park Authority issued updated operational guidelines covering minimum vehicle spacing requirements in active elephant movement corridors following the conclusion of the investigation. He did everything right and still ended up in a ditch. That is the part of this story I find most difficult to set down. It was August 3rd, 2016. And the late summer heat was already pressing down over the Gulf waters off Freeport, Texas. From shore, the surface looked calm, but a few miles out, the current told a different story. Steady, insistent, pushing long swells beneath the hull. Visibility hovered around 25 to 30 feet, the water carrying that familiar green-blue haze that softened everything just beyond reach. Cage diving trips ran regularly in this stretch of water. Smaller operators worked farther offshore, relying less on rigid systems and more on experience. Bait lines were used to draw sharks in, typically positioned at a controlled distance from the cage. When handled properly, it created a narrow window, close enough for a clear view, far enough to keep the attraction point separate from the person inside. That separation was everything. James Finch was 31, working a physically demanding trade that kept him on long shifts most weeks. He was methodical by nature, not someone drawn to unnecessary risk. But sharks had been a constant interest since childhood. Years spent reading, watching, learning their behavior. He'd booked the trip months in advance, brought a small handheld camera with him. Nothing elaborate, just enough to document the experience. Before the dive, the crew delivered a standard briefing. Stay inside the cage, keep your body clear of the bars. Do not interfere with the bait line. The instructions were clear, routine, and James followed them without hesitation. I think the best part of James's story is that he actually listened. Many people ignore safety rules and treat them like background noise, but he took them seriously, and that changed everything. When his turn came, the cage was lowered, and he descended alone. At first, the water held only distance, faint movement at the edge of visibility, shapes that passed without committing. Then the pattern changed. Two larger forms emerged from below, tiger sharks, each estimated later between 10 and 12 feet. They didn't rush. They circled wide, deliberate arcs, testing the space before tightening their approach. Above, the crew worked the bait line. The current that morning was stronger than expected, pulling against the line in a steady lateral drift. Instead of correcting for it, shortening the tether or repositioning the angle, the line was left to move with the water. It didn't swing wildly. It shifted slowly, subtly, closing distance inch by inch. At the same time, slack formed. The bait dipped lower in the water column than intended, sinking closer to the depth of the cage rather than holding its offset position. No one adjusted it. No one pulled it back out. From inside, James tracked the movement, turning within the cage to keep both the sharks and the bait in view. He stayed within the bars, never reaching beyond them, never interfering. Everything he did stayed within the limits he'd been given. But of course, he did not forget to take a picture to capture this moment. Using his waterproof camera, he positioned himself in the camera where the shark can be seen in the background. While trying to take a picture, he did not notice that the space around him was changing. One of the sharks began to lock onto the bait. Its path straightened, movements becoming more direct with each pass. The drifting line, guided by current, continued to narrow the gap until the bait and the cage occupied nearly the same plane. The separation was gone. The shark's final approach came from below and slightly off-center, rising as it accelerated. Its focus was fixed entirely on the bait. With the line now within inches of the cage, the trajectory carried straight through the structure. The impact forced its snout and jaws between the bars. Inside, there was no time to react, no space to move. James was still positioned where he was taking a photo moments before, exactly where the bait had drifted toward. The bite was not exploratory, it was a full, committed strike. Its jaws closed on the bait, but the alignment placed his arm between metal and force. The pressure pinned it against the bars as the teeth cut through in a single motion. The shark recoiled almost immediately, pulling free, but the damage had already been done. It lasted only seconds. Above the surface, the crew reacted only after the water changed, after the strike had already happened. They began hauling the cage up immediately, but the delay between drift, recognition, and response left no margin. When they brought him onto the deck, the injury was catastrophic. Severe trauma to the arm, rapid and uncontrollable blood loss. A tourniquet was applied above the elbow, but the damage had progressed too far, too quickly. He lost consciousness before they were halfway back to shore. He was pronounced dead before they arrived. The investigation that followed focused on the operation itself. The findings pointed to inadequate bait line management, failure to compensate for current conditions, and unsafe proximity between the feeding zone and the cage. His camera was given back to his family, keeping it as a remembrance. A lot of you asked in the comments of my last video why I keep stressing operator responsibility. This case is exactly why. James followed every rule, but the crew's negligence erased the margin of safety. It was August 23, 2016, and the dry winter air across Namibia's northeastern bushveld carried sound for miles. A small, unfenced safari camp operated along a seasonal riverbed in a private conservancy bordering a major national park. The camp's remote location and lack of permanent fencing were part of its appeal, offering guests an immersive wilderness experience with nothing between them and the African bush but canvas and kerosene lanterns. Joreth Vanderkamp was a 43-year-old technology consultant from Portland, Oregon, who had booked the 3-night bush camp as the centerpiece of a Namibian safari. Vanderkamp considered himself experienced in outdoor settings, citing extensive backpacking across the American West, and had expressed amusement during the camp's evening safety briefing at what he considered excessive caution. The briefing had been thorough and direct. After dark, guests were not to leave their tents for any reason without radioing the duty staff member, who would escort them with a spotlight. Predators, including leopard, hyena, and occasionally lion, moved freely through the camp area at night. The trails between tents and the main lodge were unlit and unfenced. The camp manager repeated the radio protocol twice and confirmed each guest understood. Vanderkamp retired to his tent shortly after dinner. His tent was the farthest from the central lodge, positioned at the edge of the dry riverbed, approximately 150 feet from the nearest occupied structure. A handheld radio sat on his bedside table. According to the camp's account and the subsequent investigation, staff heard a commotion at approximately 11:40 p.m. A tracker on night duty had been aware that a large male leopard had dragged a fresh impala kill into a thicket along the riverbed earlier that evening. The kill site was approximately 80 feet from Vanderkamp's tent. Leopards are among Africa's most elusive and powerful predators, with adult males weighing up to 175 pounds, compact but extraordinarily muscular for their size. They are predominantly nocturnal hunters capable of killing prey twice their weight, using a suffocation bite to the throat. When feeding, leopards become extremely defensive of their kills, reacting with explosive violence to any perceived threat at close range. Their night vision is far more sensitive than that of humans in low light, and they move through darkness in near total silence. At close quarters, a leopard's speed and bite can inflict catastrophic damage before a victim can react. Scene reconstruction and evidence at the site indicated that Vanderkamp left his tent without his radio. His headlamp was recovered near the tent entrance, switched off. Boot tracks in the sandy riverbed showed he had moved toward the thicket where the leopard was feeding. Investigators believe he heard unfamiliar sounds carrying through the still night air and left the tent to investigate, possibly unaware of what he was approaching. The tracks showed no sign of retreat, suggesting he did not realize the danger until he was already within the leopard's defensive range. The camp tracker reached the area within minutes of hearing sounds of disturbance. He found Vanderkamp approximately 15 feet from the impala carcass, face down in the sand. The leopard had retreated a short distance and remained in the vicinity, but out of sight. The injuries were concentrated on Vanderkamp's throat, consistent with a leopard's defensive attack pattern at extremely close range. A single deep bite had penetrated the throat, causing rapid blood loss. Superficial claw marks across his face indicated brief contact before the killing bite. Based on the evidence, camp staff and investigators concluded the attack appears to have lasted only seconds. Emergency radio contact was established with the nearest town, but the camp's isolation meant medical evacuation was not possible for several hours. Vanderkamp had bled out rapidly from the throat injuries. He was confirmed dead at the scene. The investigation determined that Vanderkamp had voluntarily left his tent at night without using the radio, without a light source, and had walked directly toward an active predator feeding site. The camp and its staff were cleared of responsibility. The leopard was not pursued. It was September 16th, 2017, in a remote forested region of eastern Russia. As bears entered a period of intensive feeding before winter, sightings across the region had grown increasingly frequent. Dmitry Ivanov, 31, had built a modest social media following through his fitness journey, regularly posting videos of himself far too comfortable around wild animals. And unfortunately, that's a mindset that tends to work perfectly, right up until the moment it doesn't. That single line sums up every case in this episode. On that morning, Dmitry set out alone on a hiking trip through a remote section of forest. No guide, no companion, already a serious risk during peak feeding season, with or without a camera. I want to point this out because it gets overlooked. Before the bear ever appeared, before the phone even came out, Dmitry had already made a decision that put him in danger. He wasn't thinking about what could go wrong. He was thinking about the content. The hike proceeded normally for hours until he noticed movement off the trail, a large brown bear feeding near a fallen tree, roughly 30 yards away, unaware of him. It was simply existing in its own environment. Dmitry pulled out his phone and recorded several videos from the trail. That would have been enough, but Dmitry kept going. As the bear continued feeding without reacting, something shifted in him. It was no longer enough to film from a distance. He wanted a selfie, one photograph close enough to prove he had stood beside a wild brown bear and walked away from it. He stepped off the trail. Every yard he gained made the situation more dangerous, but the bear kept feeding, and Dmitri interpreted that as permission, one of the most common mistakes people make around wildlife. Then the bear noticed him. Attention locked on immediately, and the atmosphere changed. The bear rose onto its hind legs, huffing, ears rotated backward, a clear warning. And unfortunately, Dmitri waited far too long to recognize that. His foot caught an exposed root, and he fell heavily onto one knee, a terrible moment to stumble. The bear reacted immediately, closing the remaining distance almost instantly when Dmitri stumbled. The attack lasted less than a minute, but caused devastating trauma to his chest, neck, and head. Rescue teams later located him using his emergency beacon, but he succumbed to his injuries before reaching definitive medical care. Wildlife officials investigated and identified the bear as a healthy animal with no history of aggression. No action was taken against it. The bear hadn't gone looking for Dmitri, hadn't entered the town, hadn't wandered into anyone's backyard. The entire encounter happened inside the bear's environment, and it simply reacted when a person ignored its warnings and kept approaching. It was June 14, 2026, in the cold, murky water of False Bay, South Africa, where the morning had opened overcast and still. Overnight currents had pulled sediment-heavy water across the filming zone, dropping visibility beneath the surface to somewhere between 10 and 15 feet. The production was a survival thriller filming its most expensive underwater sequence, involving stunt divers moving through an artificial submerged shipwreck set. The schedule had already slipped twice. The filming permit expired within 48 hours. Poor weather was forecast for the rest of the week, and the marine support crew was contracted only through Friday. 5 stunt divers had been assigned to the sequence. Thayer Vossen, 43, coordinated the operation from the surface. Brenek Solari, 28, Corwin Dragor, 31, Tavrin Kest, 35, and Osric Vale, 33, were the 4 entering the water. Merrick Halden, 55, served as the production's marine safety consultant, a former research vessel captain with decades of experience in South African coastal waters. Brenek's position matters. In stunt work, reputation often goes to those willing to take the risk. Local operators had logged shark sightings near seal colonies along the southern edge of the bay in the days before filming. Merrick recommended keeping the dedicated recovery vessel at anchor within the zone at all times and advised postponing if conditions deteriorated. Management concluded existing procedures were adequate to continue. That morning, the recovery vessel had been reassigned to collect replacement lighting equipment damaged earlier in the week. It had not returned by the time diving began. 30 minutes before the dive, a spotter observed a large dorsal fin approximately 200 yards from the set. When it disappeared, management determined the risk remained acceptable and authorized the dive. A confirmed sighting. Poor visibility. No recovery vessel. The outcome was being invited in. Brenek, Corwin, Tavrin, and Osric entered the water together and moved into position around the shipwreck structure. Great white sharks hunt using a single explosive ambush strike from depth, accelerating upward with enough force to be nearly impossible to detect before contact. In water below 15 feet of visibility, a diver in a dark wetsuit moving along a submerged structure produces a silhouette the animal is wired to pursue. It does not distinguish. It commits. At 9:15 in the morning, Brenek had moved slightly away from the group while repositioning a guide marker along the outer edge of the set. A large, great white surged from below and struck him with full force, inflicting catastrophic injuries to his torso and lower body. Emergency recall signals fired immediately. Corwin and Tavern were closest and moved toward him at once. As they worked to secure Brenek and pull him toward the recovery line, the blood, movement, and deploying flotation equipment kept the shark close. It made a second high-speed pass through the group. Corwin sustained severe injuries to one leg. Tavren suffered major trauma to his shoulder and upper arm. Osric was filming from another position near the wreck when the recall reached him. As he moved toward the group to assist, the shark made one final brief pass. The bite caught his lower leg before the animal disappeared into deeper water. The entire sequence lasted only a few minutes. 4 stuntmen injured in one unraveling emergency. The shark struck once and stayed close because everything happening in that water told it to. The rest followed from the chaos. All 4 were brought toward the surface simultaneously. During the evacuation, Corwin became entangled in a temporary guide cable left attached to the shipwreck frame after an equipment relocation earlier that week. Already losing blood rapidly, he became trapped long enough for rescuers to lose visual contact in near-zero visibility caused by disturbed sediment. He was eventually located and freed, but the combination of blood loss, entanglement, and time underwater had already decided the outcome. Corwin Dragor died before reaching shore. Brenek Solari was declared dead shortly after being brought aboard the support vessel. Tavern survived after extensive surgery. Osric survived following multiple reconstructive procedures. One shark, a few minutes, 2 dead. The attack happened in the water. The mistake happened on land. Investigators cited the recovery vessel's absence, the unsecured guide cable, and the decision to continue diving after the morning sighting as primary contributing factors. The film was permanently abandoned. Footage recovered from underwater equipment was reviewed during the inquiry but never publicly released, with the production company citing active litigation and the wishes of both families.
The morning of November 2nd, 2019 was cool and clear on a private reserve in the north of South Africa, where a small group set out on foot behind an armed guide for a walking safari. A walking safari is the closest thing left to the old way of seeing Africa, out on your own 2 feet, with strict rules that exist because there is no vehicle to climb back into when something goes wrong. The guide had gone over those rules with them that morning, slowly and clearly. Stay together. Stay behind him. Do exactly what he says the very instant he says it. Hannah Reyes was near the back of the line when the guide brought them up, slowly and carefully and downwind on a black rhino. Hannah was 33, an American on her first walking safari, and she had listened to every word of the briefing and had meant her agreement to all of it. But a black rhino standing at 100 feet, half screened by scrub, does not make a good photograph, and the group had been stopped in a tight, silent line behind a low tangle of thorn bush where the angle on the animal was poor. Hannah wanted the shot clear and open, rather than ask the guide or simply wait for the rhino to move. She stepped quietly out of the line and moved off to the side on her own, out from behind the cover of the thorn bush, toward a place where she would have the whole animal in the open. The guide caught the movement and saw her go, and could not shout, because a raised voice at that range was every bit as likely to set the rhino off as anything she might do herself, and he was already turning to get the rest of the group down low and back. A black rhino sees very poorly, and lives by sound and by scent, and the great hidden danger in it is that it will commit fully to a charge at a noise or a smell, without ever once clearly seeing the thing that made it. Hannah, now out in the open on her own, put her weight down on a dry branch that cracked like a gunshot in the still morning air, and then, seeing the guide gesturing at her in a fury of silence, tried to hurry back to the group and only made more noise in her rush. To the rhino, she had just become the one loud, moving thing in the whole still world, out on its own, well away from the quiet, clustered mass of the others. The single file on a rhino walk is the whole thing keeping you alive. She stepped out of it for a clearer angle on a photo. A black rhino does not need to see a target clearly to destroy it. It turns toward a sound close by, and it drives at that sound at a speed that seems flatly impossible for an animal so heavy, well over 30 miles an hour, head lowered, front horn leading. It does not slow down to work out what it is about to hit. On open ground, in the few seconds it takes to close the gap, a person on foot has no hope of outrunning it and nothing anywhere to get in behind. The rhino spun toward the noise and came straight at Hannah, out in the open and well away from the rest of the group. It was over in a few seconds, and there was no outpacing any of it. The guide threw the others flat and got behind what cover there was and had his rifle coming up. But a walking guide's rifle is a desperate last resort against a charge already underway, and there was no clear shot to be had with Hannah directly between him and the animal. The rhino reached her at a full run, took her off her feet on the front horn, flung her down, and then wheeled straight back to hit her again where she had fallen, the way a rhino always does, never satisfied with the first contact. By the time the guide could have put in a shot, the animal was already turning away, blood up, crashing back toward the thick scrub. It left Hannah broken on the open ground, with injuries that nothing in the group's small medical kit could begin to meet, so very far from any real help. She stepped out of the line for a photo and gave away the one thing the whole walk was built to protect, the distance. The guide got a call out, and the group half-carried Hannah toward the nearest place a vehicle could reach, but the reserve was remote and the injuries catastrophic, and too much time went by over rough ground before real help was possible. She did not survive it. The rhino, which had done nothing at all but answer a sudden closed noise, the only way its kind ever answers one, was left entirely alone. The reserve went back over the walk and could find no fault in how the guide had run it, only a guest who had broken the one rule it depended on. Hannah's people were told back in the United States. Afterward, the operator kept its walking groups tighter and made the briefing blunter, though it had already said everything that needed saying.
It was November 11th, 2014. The dry season in northern Botswana had drawn the seasonal floodplains down to cracked margins, and the night air across the delta carried the deep silence that settles over the African bush when no wind moves through the scrub. Temperatures dropped sharply after dark, and the camp sat beside dried floodplain channels that, in wet years, carried water through the area, but in the dry months served as natural movement corridors for every large animal in the region. The camp had no perimeter fencing. This was by design. I find that detail unsettling every time I return to it, not because it was wrong, but because it was honest. The camp existed inside the bush, not beside it. Rachel Kim was a 29-year-old travel blogger based in the United States whose platform focused on immersive wildlife and adventure travel experiences. She had built a following through a combination of high-quality field photography and detailed written accounts of remote destinations, and she approached each assignment with the dual perspective of participant and content producer. Her traveling companion, Sophie Lang, 31, worked as a professional photographer and had accompanied her on multiple previous international assignments. The camp manager, Kabalo Moeti, 37, had operated the property for several years and held a detailed working knowledge of the local wildlife patterns, particularly the seasonal movement of large predators and scavengers through the camp area during dry months when food sources became concentrated. During the evening meal, Kim retained a portion of grilled meat, wrapping it and keeping it inside her tent after returning for the night. The camp's standing instructions to all guests, issued at check-in and repeated before each evening, were explicit. No food items of any kind were to be carried into sleeping tents, and nothing edible was to be removed from the communal dining area and taken outside after dark. The reason for this instruction was well established by the camp's operational history. Spotted hyenas in the surrounding area had developed a persistent association between the camp and food odors across multiple dry seasons, and their nightly movement through the tent line was a routine occurrence that staff managed through strict odor control. The instruction was not precautionary, it was operational. There is a difference, and camps like this one know it. Unfenced camps operating inside active wildlife areas function on a system of behavioral controls that substitutes for the physical barrier a fence would provide. Every protocol exists as a component of that system, and the system holds only when every component holds simultaneously. Camps that operate this way typically run without incident across multiple seasons, which can produce a gradual normalization of the rules among guests who have followed them before without consequence. The rules feel precautionary after enough uneventful nights. They are not precautionary. They are the reason the nights were uneventful. At approximately 2 a.m., sounds outside the tent registered as movement nearby. Kim exited the tent, carrying the wrapped meat, with the intention of depositing it near the communal area. Multiple hyenas were already moving through the space between the tents. The animals had been drawn by the concentrated food scent before she had opened the tent door. Spotted hyenas are among the most ecologically successful large carnivores in sub-Saharan Africa, a classification that surprises many visitors who assume they operate primarily as scavengers. Adult hyenas weigh between 90 and 190 pounds and possess the strongest bite force relative to body size of any African carnivore, sufficient to crush large bone entirely. Their intelligence, social coordination, and adaptability make them highly effective at exploiting human environments, and animals that become food-conditioned around camps develop a persistence and directional boldness that escalates significantly when direct food access appears possible. In camp settings, hyena incidents rarely begin as predatory attacks. They begin as opportunistic food-seeking behavior and can escalate sharply when a human drops below upright height, the silhouette these animals are instinctively cautious of, or when food contacts the ground near a position where multiple animals are already competing for access. One animal approached from the front as Kim retreated toward the lit pathway between structures. A second had circled to a position behind her. When she slipped on loose sand near a drainage edge, the wrapped meat fell from her hands to the ground directly beside her. The sudden drop in her body position, combined with the immediate presence of food at ground level, produced a rapid escalation in the surrounding animals' behavior, triggering competing scavenging responses among the group. That sequence, the slip, the drop, the height change, happened in under 2 seconds. The animals were already there, the variables just aligned. Camp staff responded with vehicle floodlights, sustained engine noise, and coordinated shouting from multiple positions, dispersing the animals before physical contact occurred. Kim sustained minor injuries consistent with the fall itself. The camp conducted a full review of its food storage enforcement and guest briefing procedures in the days following the incident. It was May 6, 2013, and a light onshore breeze carried the smell of wet earth and river sediment across the western coastline of Réunion Island, a small French overseas territory in the Indian Ocean east of Madagascar. The overnight rains had sent plumes of brown runoff streaming from the island's steep, volcanic interior into the ocean, carrying nutrients and organic matter that spread a murky haze across the nearshore waters. The turbid conditions drew bait fish close to the river mouths, and behind them, larger predators. Cassien Dubreuil was a 22-year-old surfer from Lyon, France, who had traveled to Réunion 3 weeks earlier as part of a gap year. Dubreuil had been surfing since the age of 14 and considered himself competent in moderate conditions, though his experience was largely confined to the well-patrolled beaches of the French Atlantic coast and the warm, clear waters of Southeast Asia. Réunion's coastline was different. The island lacked the protective barrier reef systems that shielded neighboring Mauritius, meaning deep oceanic water reached close to shore. The volcanic seafloor dropped steeply, creating conditions where large sharks could hunt within yards of the lineup. The island had experienced a sharp increase in shark encounters over the preceding 3 years, prompting authorities to post warning signs at several popular surf breaks and implement seasonal swimming restrictions. Multiple serious and fatal attacks had made Réunion one of the most statistically dangerous surfing regions during that period. Dubreuil had been warned. Wilfried Dejou, a 58-year-old surf shop owner near Saint-Gilles, had spoken with Dubreuil when he came in to rent a board several days earlier. Dejou had pointed out the posted warnings and told him which breaks locals had abandoned, particularly during rain and runoff when visibility dropped to nothing. Dubreuil had listened, but expressed confidence that the conditions looked manageable. On the morning of the attack, Dubreuil paddled out alone at a break roughly a mile south of Saint-Gilles. The spot was known among locals for its consistent swell, but had been largely abandoned by resident surfers due to its proximity to a river mouth that discharged directly into the lineup after rain. The water was brown and opaque from the previous night's runoff. The early morning light was flat and low, and visibility beneath the surface was reduced to near zero. No other surfers were in the water. Tiger sharks are powerful, broad-bodied predators that thrive in warm, turbid coastal waters, reaching lengths of 12 to 14 feet and weights approaching 1,400 pounds. They are the species commonly implicated in fatal attacks around Réunion, where the combination of murky water, steep nearshore bathymetry, and abundant prey creates ideal hunting conditions. Tiger sharks attack from below or behind, using low visibility conditions to approach undetected before delivering a single catastrophic bite with their distinctively shaped, heavily serrated teeth. These teeth are designed to shear through large prey, including sea turtles and marine mammals, and can inflict massive tissue destruction in a single pass. In turbid water, a surfer's silhouette on the surface can resemble common prey such as turtles. 2 surfers watching from shore were the only witnesses. According to their accounts, the attack happened without any visible warning. One moment, Dubreuil was sitting on his board in the lineup. The next, the water broke violently beneath him. The shark struck from directly below, its momentum carrying both predator and victim partially above the surface before crashing back down. The impact knocked Dubreuil from his board. The water around him immediately turned dark. There was no prolonged struggle. The disturbance subsided quickly. His board, severed leash still attached, washed ashore shortly afterward with a large curved section missing from the tail, consistent with a large shark. Emergency services launched a water search within 30 minutes. Partial remains were recovered later that day, or the following day, in shallow water south of the break. The injuries consistent with a single massive bite to the torso that likely caused rapid incapacitation. Investigation noted that he had entered the water alone at a break with posted shark warnings during peak risk conditions of low visibility, river runoff, and low-angle morning light. The incident prompted further restrictions in the area. It was March 22, 2018, and the late dry season had thinned the deciduous forests of a tiger reserve in Madhya Pradesh to their barest state. The undergrowth had dried to waist-high clusters of brown scrub, and seasonal streams had pretty much retreated to isolated pools, pulling wildlife toward the remaining water and drawing the reserve's resident tigers into increasingly predictable patterns. Achyutanand Doifode was a 61-year-old retired ornithology professor from Pune who had spent his career studying the bird life of the Western Ghats. His retirement had basically become one long field season, binoculars and camera permanently in his bag. Doifode had visited tiger reserves across central India on numerous occasions, though his interest had always been the birds. He genuinely viewed tiger sightings as a pleasant bonus to the real work of birding, which tells you a lot about where his head was at. The morning game drive entered the reserve's buffer zone, known among birders for a seasonal stream bed that attracted species you couldn't really find anywhere else. Doifode had specifically requested this route. The naturalist guide had been tracking fresh pug marks along the trail, a resident tigress known to patrol this territory, but an hour of driving produced no sighting. The jeep stopped at the dry stream bed. The guide pointed out pug marks continuing along the sandy bed and suggested they wait quietly. Doifode waited, scanning the trees. After several minutes, he spotted movement in a low tree about 20 yards off the trail. Through his binoculars, he identified what he believed was an Indian pita, a species he'd been wanting to photograph for genuinely years at that point. It was perched low, partially obscured by dry branches, miles and would require a better angle than the vehicle offered. He told the guide he needed to step out briefly for a clear photograph. The guide refused immediately and firmly. Park regulations straight up prohibited leaving the vehicle inside the reserve under any circumstances, and the fresh pug marks meant they were in active tiger territory. The guide emphasized that the tigress could be anywhere nearby. Doifo dismissed the concern, noting that tigers avoid humans and that the pug marks appeared to continue away from the trail. He opened the door and stepped down to the trail, moving toward the tree with his camera raised and attention fixed on the branches above. Retired professor knew more about Indian wildlife than pretty much any tourist ever will, and all that knowledge is basically what killed him. The guide straight up told him no, and he decided he knew better. I've written that sentence way too many times now. Bengal tigers are the largest big cats in Asia, with adult females weighing between 220 and 350 pounds and males exceeding 500 pounds. They're solitary ambush predators that can move through dense undergrowth completely undetected, their striped coats making them basically invisible in dappled light and dry vegetation. Tigers attack from behind or the side, delivering a killing bite to the throat or nape of the neck. They can close short distances with startling speed. Scene evidence later suggested that the tigress had not moved away from the area as the pug marks implied. She'd just been sitting there concealed in dense undergrowth on the same side of the trail that Doifo was now walking toward, likely resting in shade near the dry stream bed, her body invisible in the dappled brown and orange of the forest floor. Doifo was about 15 yards from the vehicle, his face tilted upward toward the bird, when the tigress attacked from behind and to his right. The strike knocked him face down to the trail. The tigress's jaws closed on the back of his neck in a bite pattern, consistent with how tigers take down prey. Based on scene evidence, authorities believed the neck injuries were rapidly fatal. The guide laid on the horn and shouted. The tigress released immediately and retreated into the undergrowth, disappearing within seconds. The guide didn't get out of the vehicle, which is standard protocol during an active tiger encounter in Indian reserves, where guides are typically unarmed. The guide radioed park authorities. Forest rangers reached the scene within 30 minutes. Doifo was confirmed dead. Forest staff believed the tigress involved was a known resident female that had been regularly seen in that sector of the reserve. She was not destroyed. Authorities found no evidence she had targeted humans as prey, and the victim had entered her territory in violation of park regulations. You know what gets me? That bird was probably still sitting right there in the tree when the rangers showed up, 15 yards from where they found him. The exact thing he stepped out of the vehicle to photograph. He never even got the shot. On July 21, 2014, near Kibale National Park in western Uganda, 34-year-old wildlife field operator Paavo Karkkainen entered a restricted forest valley alone before sunrise. Rangers had already warned staff the previous evening about an unusually aggressive adult male chimpanzee moving through the area after several recent charging incidents near the trail network. Paavo was not inexperienced. Originally from Tampere, Finland, he had spent more than a decade working wildlife expeditions across Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. By 2014, he had been stationed near Fort Portal for almost a year, assisting a primate behavior research project that monitored habituated chimpanzees inside protected forest sectors. Colleagues later described him as calm, capable, and increasingly confident around chimpanzees, confident enough that safety restrictions sometimes felt unnecessary to him. The evening before the incident, rangers specifically instructed research staff not to enter the Western Valley trails before daylight and not to approach chimp vocalizations without armed ranger accompaniment. A colleague later told investigators that Paavo acknowledged the warning and casually mentioned he would check the area himself before the rest of the team arrived. The next morning, he entered the forest alone. Chimpanzees are among the strongest primates on Earth relative to body size. Adult males can weigh over 130 pounds and possess explosive upper body strength far beyond that of an average human. But what makes close-range encounters dangerous is unpredictability. Agitated chimpanzees can move silently through dense vegetation before erupting into sudden violence at extremely short range. Their attacks are chaotic and fast, often involving repeated biting, grabbing, tearing, and blunt force strikes directed at the face, hands, or upper body. Scene reconstruction conducted by Ugandan wildlife authorities later placed Paavo nearly 3/4 of a mile beyond the marked trail boundary at around 5:40 a.m. before full daylight reached the forest floor. Broken vegetation, blood evidence, and disturbance patterns in the undergrowth indicated prolonged violent contact across several meters. Investigators believed Paavo encountered the chimpanzee at extremely close range due to the density of the vegetation and the limited visibility inside the valley corridor. I think this is the detail that changes the way people picture this story. Chimpanzees do not feel dangerous in the same way lions or crocodiles do. They look familiar, intelligent, almost understandable, but an agitated adult male chimpanzee moving through dense forest operates on pure territorial instinct. Once Pavo crossed into that valley alone before sunrise, he entered an environment where reaction time and visibility no longer belonged to him. Evidence recovered at the scene indicated the attack was sudden and overwhelming. Investigators concluded that Pavo sustained catastrophic injuries within minutes of first contact. By the time rangers reached the area later that morning after he was reported missing, the chimpanzee had already disappeared deeper into the forest. Paavo Karkkainen was pronounced dead at the scene. The Wildlife Authority later conducted a formal review alongside the research organization overseeing the project. The death was categorized as a preventable field operations fatality. Internal rules required ranger accompaniment during heightened aggression incidents and prohibited solo movement into restricted sectors before daylight. Procedures investigators confirmed had not been followed. No criminal charges were filed, though the organization later revised its field policies to require mandatory radio confirmation before anyone entered active chimpanzee zones alone. What I keep returning to here is how experience can slowly reshape a person's sense of risk. Paavo had spent years around chimpanzees. He knew the sounds, the movement patterns, the warning displays. The rangers gave him the information, and he understood it well enough to repeat it back. Then he entered the valley alone anyway. That gap between hearing a warning and believing it truly applies to you, that's where this story actually ends. It was September 14th, 2015, along a quiet stretch of Central Florida coastline south of the main tourist beaches, where the afternoon air sat warm and heavy over the water. The day had been bright, but hours of strong wave action had churned the shallows into a clouded brown haze, and dense schools of mullet kept breathing the surface as they pushed parallel to the sand. Zinnia Vale, 24, was a travel and outdoor lifestyle influencer who had spent several years building an audience through beach photography and destination videos. By that year, she had gathered roughly 40,000 followers, enough to turn content creation into her main source of income. People who knew her described her as competitive and hardworking, the kind of person who watched closely which posts performed and which ones did not. I think that detail is important. When standing out is how you make money, it's easy to convince yourself to take one more risk. That summer, her engagement had been slipping, and the travel content space had grown crowded. She was collecting material for a new series on Florida's beaches and wildlife when she reached this stretch of shore. In the days before her visit, migrating mullet had pulled predators close to the beach, and a posted advisory near the access path urged swimmers to use caution during heavy baitfish activity. A lifeguard had also mentioned that conditions were poor and that the water was getting risky. She saw the warning and went in anyway. To me, that's the moment this stopped being bad luck and became a choice. Carrying a waterproof camera, she moved out between knee and waist depth and began filming the schools as they passed along the beach. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. As she stood there, several surfers paddling back to shore told her they were leaving because sharks had been actively chasing the baitfish nearby. She stayed in the water anyway. Other witnesses later recalled the bait repeatedly scattering around her, which is one of the clearest signs that a predator is working an area. Bull sharks are among the most dangerous sharks in shallow, murky water. They tolerate low salinity, patrol close to shore, and hunt aggressively when visibility is poor, striking fast at sudden movement and at the dense bait they follow into knee-deep water. In conditions exactly like that afternoon, a swimmer standing inside a feeding zone faces sharply increased risk. What makes bull sharks especially difficult to spot is that the water they prefer often hides them completely. Heavy rain, stirred-up sand, river outflow, and schools of baitfish can turn the shallows into a place where neither predator nor swimmer can see very far. The strike came as a sudden eruption of water. Witnesses caught only a brief glimpse of a large shark before it disappeared beneath the surface, the entire contact lasting a matter of seconds. The bite tore into Zinnia's upper thigh, severing the femoral artery and removing a large section of tissue, which triggered catastrophic blood loss almost at once. Nearby surfers reacted instantly, paddling to her and supporting her above the surface while shouting for the lifeguards. She remained responsive for a short time, but her condition fell quickly as the bleeding continued. Lifeguards reached her within minutes and brought her to shore, where emergency crews worked to control the hemorrhage before transporting her to a nearby trauma center. Despite aggressive treatment and emergency surgery, she died later that evening. Because she had an online following, news of her death spread through local outlets and online communities, though it stayed mostly regional. Investigators found no evidence of unusual shark behavior. Marine specialists believed a bull shark was the most likely species species involved based on the location, the water conditions, and the wound characteristics, though no one could confirm it with certainty. They concluded the attack came from several known risk factors stacking together: murky water, dense baitfish, active predators, and a swimmer who stayed despite repeated warnings. Friends remembered her as ambitious and passionate, someone who sometimes accepted risks that felt manageable in the moment. Her waterproof camera was recovered from the shallows by responders, but authorities never released the recording publicly, both out of respect for her family and because the footage was considered too graphic to share. Looking back, I think this one was avoidable. Zinnia did not wade in planning to take a major risk. She waded in believing she was capturing something unique, and she stayed even after surfers told her to her face that sharks were hunting right where she was standing. That is exactly how a chain of ignored warnings turns into something irreversible. It was July 19th, 2018, a brutally hot day at a drive-through wildlife park in Florida. Several adult lions had settled near a restricted enclosure, resting in open shade, alert but stationary, attention shifting occasionally toward passing vehicles. Jennifer Reed, 27, a geologist, had entered the facility as part of a guided park visit. She was passionate about geology and had spent time in wildlife regions before. Wilderness was not a warning to her. It was her refuge. This case is the most uncomfortable one because of what came before it. According to prior records, she had a consistent habit of ignoring safety protocols around large animals and had been warned before for crossing restricted zones. Her concerns regarding the reserve's safety were clearly negligent. The wildlife system isn't built for exploration. It's built to observe at a safe distance. As always, the group was briefed beforehand. Stay inside the vehicle. Keep windows closed. Follow the guide's instructions. The guide, an experienced operator, delivered it routinely, assuming visitors were there to follow the rules, not break them. I don't blame him for that assumption. Most people do follow the rules, which is exactly why these incidents feel so jarring. When the vehicle reached the lions, roughly 30 feet from the track, one lioness was awake and sharply tracking movement, calm, collected, calculated. This was predatory focus, the natural instinct of an apex predator sensing unfamiliar movement. The guide reinforced the importance of the park's safety instructions to remain inside the vehicle, and stepping outside could not just be a safety hazard, it could be a critical, life-endangering encounter. Lions in parks and reserves see vehicles as default entities, not prey. The animals are used to vehicles as a single stationary object. The moment that object breaks its expected shape, it's no longer a stationary entity. It becomes a potential hazard, and lions are well equipped to deal with such hazards. When a human body becomes externally visible to apex predators, their demeanor shifts. Once a human comes under the radar of a large predator like a lion, the chances of coming out unscathed become quite slim. This was the moment the lion's pattern changed. Jennifer opened the vehicle door and stepped partially outside to get a selfie. The guide immediately instructed her to return. The instruction wasn't followed, and she moved further out, fully exposed on open ground. I'll be candid, this is the moment that frustrates me most. There's a difference between an honest mistake and a deliberate, repeated choice to ignore a direct warning. This was the latter. This is proof the failure wasn't in the system. It was the breakdown of adherence at the exact moment adherence mattered most. The lioness, until then resting alert, shifted posture, head lowered, shoulders engaged, attention locked onto the figure now standing in the open. This is the typical predatory posture large felines show when a perceived boundary is violated. The distance between the enclosure and the vehicle was approximately 25 feet, a distance that didn't do Jennifer any favors. The lioness covered it in seconds. The lioness made direct contact with Jennifer outside the vehicle. Other passengers began shouting, the guide attempted to intervene, and the lioness clamped onto the side of her head and neck before disengaging as the commotion escalated. Jennifer suffered catastrophic skull fractures and severe cervical spine trauma, and despite emergency treatment was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Reserve investigators later confirmed all procedural safeguards had been correctly implemented. Instructions clear, repeated, aligned with protocol. The determining factor wasn't system failure, but individual deviation at the moment of enforcement. This is one of the cleanest examples of a death the safety system anticipated and tried to prevent, and still couldn't, because a system can only do so much against someone who steps around it. It was March 17, 2018, and the afternoon heat pressed down on a dusty track winding through a wildlife reserve in southeastern Sri Lanka. The dry season had drawn wild Asian elephants toward the remaining waterholes, making sightings guaranteed for the jeep safari operators running daily excursions. A lone adult elephant stood at the track's edge. Mirodin Petrescu was a 37-year-old fitness influencer from Bucharest, Romania, whose social media following had grown rapidly through a combination of physique content and increasingly provocative travel videos. Petrescu had arrived in Sri Lanka 10 days earlier, documenting the trip for his platforms with an emphasis on close encounters with wildlife. His companion, Luminitsa Aldea, 29, sat in the rear of the open-top safari jeep. Petrescu had previously filmed himself approaching stray dogs in Istanbul and feeding wild monkeys by hand in Bali, content that had performed well enough to convince him that animals were predictable up close. The guide stopped the jeep at a safe distance and instructed the group to photograph from their seats. Petrescu expressed dissatisfaction with the distance. The guide refused to move closer. Without waiting for permission, Petrescu climbed over the side of the open jeep, carrying his phone on a selfie stick, and walked directly toward the elephant along the dirt track. The guide shouted for him to return immediately. According to the guide's account and passenger statements, Petrescu approached to within approximately 30 feet. He turned his back to the elephant and began filming himself with the animal in the background. When the elephant did not react visibly, Petrescu moved closer and began clapping his hands and stamping his feet, apparently attempting to provoke the animal into a dramatic reaction for the camera. Asian elephants are among the most powerful land animals on Earth, with adult males weighing between 8,000 and 11,000 pounds. Despite their size, elephants can accelerate to 25 miles per hour in a charge, covering short distances with startling speed. Elephants communicate agitation through ear flaring, head shaking, and mock charges before committing to full contact. However, when provoked at close range, particularly solitary males, the transition from warning to lethal charge can happen without the mock charge phase entirely. A single blow from the trunk or a front foot strike delivers thousands of pounds of crushing force. The elephant's ears flared wide, its head rose, and its trunk curled upward. Petrescu either did not recognize or chose to ignore the warning posture. He clapped his hands once more. The elephant charged without a preliminary mock charge. The acceleration was immediate, covering the remaining distance in seconds. Petrescu turned to run, but managed only a few strides before the elephant slammed into him with its head and trunk, the impact launching him onto the track surface. The elephant was on him immediately, driving its front feet down in multiple crushing stomps in quick succession. The force shattered his pelvis, spine, and rib cage in rapid succession. The animal stepped back, ears still flared, trunk raised, before turning and moving off the track into the brush. The guide drove forward immediately, reaching Petrescu within seconds. He was unresponsive. The injuries were immediately and visibly fatal. Miradon Petrescu was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities recovered his phone from the trackside, its screen shattered. The investigation confirmed that Petrescu had voluntarily exited the vehicle and provoked the elephant in direct violation of the reserve's rules. Wildlife officials issued a public statement about the dangers of approaching wild elephants on foot. The guide and operator were cleared of liability. It was April 2nd, 2016, and the waters off Grand Bahama carried that steady, rolling movement that doesn't look dangerous until you're in it. The surface reflected a bright, flattened sky, but below, visibility dropped to around 20 to 25 feet, turning everything into shifting shapes and muted outlines. The current moved just enough to keep suspended equipment drifting slightly out of position. This trip wasn't advertised as a standard cage dive. The operator framed it as something more immersive. A modified setup designed to reduce visual obstruction and bring divers closer to the animals. Less steel, wider spacing, and a more open feel compared to traditional cages. Silas Mercer was 38, working a physically demanding job that didn't leave him much time for trips like this. When he did take one, he didn't want a watered-down version of the experience. People who knew him described him as someone who preferred things done fully. If there was a way to get closer, he would take it. I've reported on other stories where that same attitude mattered most. People wanted the absolute best experience, and that exact desire ended up being the most important part of what happened. That mindset lined up perfectly with what this operation was offering. The briefing reflected that tone. The crew emphasized awareness and balance, but didn't go deep into how the modified cage changed the level of protection. There was no detailed explanation of spacing tolerances, no comparison to standard safety designs. Just a general instruction to stay inside and remain steady. When Silas entered the cage with his waterproof camera, the difference was obvious. The bars were spaced wider than what you'd expect in a typical setup. Not wide enough to step through, but wide enough that the barrier didn't feel solid anymore. When you looked out, the structure almost disappeared, giving a clearer, more direct view into the water. This setup was the perfect setup for photographs. That was the selling point, but it also meant the margin for error was thinner. At first, everything worked the way it was intended. A few sharks passed at a distance, moving in and out of the visibility range. The cage drifted slightly with the current, requiring constant small adjustments in footing. Then a larger tiger shark came into view. Witnesses later estimated it at around 11 to 12 feet, moving slowly along the lower edge of the cage. It didn't charge or rush. It circled, maintaining a controlled distance as it inspected the structure. Silas shifted to follow it. Using his waterproof camera, he took pictures of the animal. He lowered his stance and moved toward the front section where the visibility was best. One hand braced lightly against the bars as the cage moved under him, his focus locked on keeping the shark in frame. He stayed inside. That part never changed. He took photographs, selfies, and videos with the animal right around him. As the shark made another pass, it angled closer to the cage wall. Tiger sharks often investigate by moving along edges, turning slightly inward to test objects in their environment. When it passed the front section, the alignment was there. Silas's upper arm, pressed near the bars for balance, sat within the wider spacing, close enough that part of the soft tissue extended beyond the protective plane of the cage without fully crossing it. It wasn't something he could see. The shark made contact. Not a high-speed strike, but a controlled, investigative bite that became destructive because of the access. The jaws closed across his upper arm, pulling him into the bars as the force pinned him against the frame. The entire sequence lasted only seconds. When the shark released, Silas fell backward inside the cage. From above, the crew saw the disturbance and immediately began pulling the cage up, but retrieval still took time. The movement of the water and the weight of the structure slowed the process just enough to matter. By the time they got him onto the platform, he was already losing consciousness. The injury was high on the arm, near major vessels, making bleeding extremely difficult to control in that environment. The crew attempted emergency measures, but the severity and location of the wound left little room for stabilization. He was pronounced dead before reaching shore. Inspectors documented that the spacing between bars exceeded commonly accepted safety standards for large shark interactions. The structure was identified as a modified configuration that had not undergone formal testing or certification for that type of use. His camera was kept for the sole privacy of the victim. The official conclusion stated that the experimental design reduced the effectiveness of the protective barrier, allowing unintended exposure despite the diver remaining inside the cage. The operation was suspended shortly after. I have been in water where it was hard to see past 20 feet, and it felt creepy. Looking at Silas's situation, those big gaps in the cage would have made me second-guess everything I did.
The afternoon of September 23rd, 2021 was still and hot on the Okavango Delta. In Botswana, where the safari is done from a mokoro, a shallow dugout canoe pulled quietly through the reeds by a guide standing in the stern. A pair of the little canoes moved slowly along a channel of clear water, the guests sitting right down at the waterline, close enough to trail a hand in the water beside them. Chloe Adkins was in the front canoe, a young British traveler on the trip of her life, camera up, when a pod of hippos surfaced out in the deeper water ahead of them, ears flicking, eyes and broad backs breaking the surface. Chloe was 28 and thrilled by the whole delta, and she wanted the hippos far closer than the guide pulling her canoe would take her. He had already begun angling the mokoro away toward the reeds and the shallows, exactly the way they are trained to, keeping the distance open and keeping the canoe out of the deep water where a hippo can come up underneath it from below. A mokoro rides an inch above the surface and offers a hippo no resistance at all, which is the entire reason the safety of it depends on staying well back and never crowding the animals. Chloe asked him to take her in closer for the photograph. He told her no, and kept steadily poling for the shallow water. What happened next is not fully clear, because the two people who could say for certain were in the water within a minute. What is clear is that the front canoe ended up far nearer the pod than the guide had wanted, whether Chloe leaned and shifted her weight to close the gap, or the channel pinched them in, or both. A mokoro is a delicate, tippy thing. It answers to every small movement, and a guest leaning right out over the side to reach a photograph can swing the whole canoe toward exactly the deep water the guide is working so hard to stay out of. The front of the canoe drifted out over the edge of the deep channel where the pod had gone down, and a bull hippo came up beneath it. The whole safety of a mokoro is distance. She wanted a closer photo, and closer is the one thing that safety cannot survive. A hippo kills more people in Africa than any of the big cats, and on the water it is at its most dangerous. It can move along the bottom unseen, come up under a boat with enough force to throw it into the air, and it bites with a jaw that can crush a mokoro and everyone in it. It does not need to be provoked in any way a person would even recognize as provocation. A thin canoe drifting over its head in its channel is provocation more than enough. The bull came up under the front of the canoe and flipped it clean over, and Chloe and her guide were in the water in an instant, in the deep channel, in among the surfacing pod. The second mokoro was too far back to do anything at all but watch it happen. In the water, a hippo is faster than any swimmer alive, and it does not miss, and the bull turned at once on the nearest thing, thrashing at the surface. It came up and took Chloe in a single closing of its jaws, pulled her straight under, and the water where she had been went white and then dark and then still. Her guide, by some mix of luck and skill and knowing precisely what to do, reached the reeds and the shallows and hauled himself out of the channel. There had been only a few seconds between the canoe going over and the water going quiet, and in those few seconds, there was nothing on Earth that anyone could have done to change how it ended. Everyone pictures the lion or the crocodile. The hippo kills more people than either, mostly people who thought it looked harmless. The second canoe got its guests to the bank and the alarm went back to camp, and a search went on into the next day, but a hippo attack in deep water leaves very little hope and often very little to find. Chloe was not among the living when it was done. Her guide, shaken past speaking, had done every single thing his training asked of him and had still lost a guest who would not keep the distance he had kept begging her to keep. The authorities recorded it as one more hippo death on the water, one of the most ordinary ways the Delta takes a visitor. The news made its way home to Chloe's family in Britain. The camp, which had warned her and been waved off, had nothing in its rules to tighten, only a warning it had given, and that had been ignored.
It was September 3, 2019. The late dry season in a game reserve in western Zambia had stripped the bush to its minimum. The vegetation was a compressed tangle of gray thorn scrub and dust-covered elephant paths, dense enough in places to reduce sight lines to under 10 meters. The air was still and dry, carrying scent further than usual, and the ground around a shrinking water source nearby was layered with fresh tracks from every major species in the region. The conditions were exactly those in which experienced guides exercise the most caution. I think that is worth holding on to. The conditions themselves were a warning, and the guide read every part of them correctly. Michael Torres was a 52-year-old retired professional from the United States who had dedicated a substantial portion of his retirement to international wildlife travel. He had participated in guided safaris across multiple African countries over the preceding years and considered himself a practiced and comfortable participant in bushwalking activities. His traveling companion, Naomi Reed, 48, a committed wildlife enthusiast from the same country, had selected the walking component of the itinerary, specifically for the close-range nature experience it offered. Their guide, Patrick Zulu, 44, had led walking safaris in the reserve for over 15 years, carried a legally licensed firearm as required for all guides operating on foot in areas with dangerous game, and was regarded as one of the more experienced practitioners in the region. Walking safari guiding carries a category of responsibility that has no direct equivalent in vehicle-based operations. A game drive vehicle functions as a physical and olfactory barrier between guests and the surrounding wildlife. Animals that would respond aggressively to a human figure on foot often treat a stationary vehicle as a neutral feature of the landscape. On foot, that barrier is absent entirely. What replaces it is the guide's continuous environmental assessment: track age, scent direction, bird behavior, vegetation density, wind shift. The reserve's walking program operated on the strength of that assessment, and the guests behind Zulu on any given morning were entirely dependent on it functioning without interruption. The group moved through dense brush along an elephant path toward the water source. Within a short distance, the guide identified a sequence of environmental warning indicators arriving in close succession. Fresh buffalo dung with insect activity still present on the surface, a small group of oxpeckers lifting suddenly and without apparent cause from low vegetation ahead, and the heavy livestock-like musk of buffalo drifting through the still air from a direction that placed animals nearby. He directed the group to close their spacing immediately and begin a controlled backward withdrawal from the area. Torres, who had drifted slightly to one side while attempting to photograph movement in the scrub, stepped off the designated path and partially separated his position from the rest of the group. A few meters, that is all it was. In that bush, at that moment, it was enough. A solitary old buffalo bull had been resting in the shade of dense cover at close range. The animal came out of concealment without an extended approach warning. The distance between the bull and the group at the moment of the charge was short enough that the guide had time only to raise his voice before contact occurred. African buffalo are consistently listed among the most dangerous animals on the continent, and for reasons that are frequently underestimated by those encountering them for the first time. Solitary old bulls, animals that have been expelled from the main herd and spend their days resting in thick cover, are specifically more dangerous than herd animals, exhibiting a pronounced aggression that experienced guides treat with more caution than almost any other buffalo encounter type. An adult bull can exceed 1,500 pounds and carries horns that fuse at the skull base into a solid bone mass, capable of delivering impacts that fracture vehicle bodywork. A charging buffalo uses its horns to hook, toss, and pin rather than simply to ram, and animals that charge from concealment at close range leave almost no margin for any protective response. They are also documented to double back and re-engage after an initial charge, a behavior that makes the period immediately following impact as dangerous as the impact itself. That last detail is the one guides fear most. The first charge ends the encounter for most animals. The buffalo sometimes comes back. The animal went straight to him and drove him into thorn scrub before veering back into heavy vegetation. The guide discharged a warning shot only after the initial impact, consistent with standard protocol in close-range encounters, where firing before contact risks redirecting the charge direction in a way that cannot be controlled. Torres sustained puncture and blunt force injuries. The group was extracted from the area under the guide's direction. Emergency protocols were activated at the nearest vehicle access point. The investigation confirmed that Torres had separated from the group against the guide's instruction during an active withdrawal in an area where multiple clear warning indicators were present and had been acknowledged by the guide in real time. The guide was cleared of any negligence. The reserve reviewed its pre-walk briefing protocols with specific attention to group spacing management in dense vegetation sections following the conclusion of the investigation. It was January 22, 2022, along a rugged stretch of the South African coast where the summer sun sat high over water that shifted between deep green and dark blue. The swell was moderate, the visibility decent near the surface, but fading into murk farther down, and the rocky shoreline behind him was empty, the nearest help a long way off. It was the kind of remote, productive spot that serious spearfishers seek out precisely because so few other people bother to reach it. Trevor Mattis, 41, was a construction supervisor and a dedicated recreational spearfisher. He had years of experience in the water and a deep confidence in his own ability, the sort built over countless dives that had gone exactly the way he expected. That confidence had a flip side, though. He tended to view safety recommendations as overcautious, the kind of advice meant for less experienced divers, and friends often joked that Trevor believed experience made him immune to mistakes. That's what stands out to me. Past success gave him confidence, but the habit he refused to change cost him his life. Trevor regularly traveled to coastal areas known for productive spearfishing, and this stretch of South African coast was among the richest, holding good numbers of fish, and, just as importantly, sitting squarely within waters where great white sharks are known to patrol. Experienced divers had warned him about this more than once. The specific concern was always the same, that staying in the water too long after a catch and carrying bleeding fish attached to his body was an invitation in a region full of large predators. Most serious spearfishers there towed their catch well behind them on a separate float line for exactly that reason. Trevor preferred clipping his fish directly to his belt instead, keeping them close and within easy reach. He had heard the warnings repeatedly. He simply did not change the way he dove, because nothing bad had ever happened before, and to him, that was proof enough that nothing would. That day, diving solo, Trevor had a productive session and successfully speared several large fish. The reasonable move, the one every warning had pointed toward, was to bring his catch in and get out of the water. Instead, he clipped the speared fish to the belt at his waist and kept hunting, the bleeding bodies trailing against him as he moved. Each fish leaked blood and fluids into the water, and each one twitched and struggled, sending out exactly the kind of vibrations and scent trail that travel a long way through the ocean. He had effectively turned himself into a source of everything a large predator hunts by, and he stayed out there, alone, long after he should have been back on the rocks. Great white sharks are among the largest predatory fish in the ocean, reaching lengths well over 15 feet and weights beyond 2,000 pounds, and the waters off South Africa hold one of the most concentrated populations on the planet. They possess an extraordinary sense for detecting blood, vibration, and the erratic movements of injured prey, often from considerable distances. A great white does not typically hunt people. It hunts seals, sea lions, and fish, and it tracks them by exactly the kind of disturbance a wounded fish gives off. A diver carrying a string of bleeding, struggling catch against his body, in practical terms, broadcasting the signal of injured prey. The danger was never that the shark wanted Trevor. The danger was that Trevor had attached himself to what the shark wanted. A great white drawn in by the struggling, bleeding fish closed in fast and struck at the catch clipped to his waist. There was little warning in open water like that, just the sudden arrival of an enormous animal homing in on the scent trail he had been dragging behind him. The shark was almost certainly targeting the fish rather than the man, but with the catch fixed to his belt, there was no separating the two. The bite tore through the fish and into his hip and upper thigh, severing the femoral artery and causing catastrophic blood loss in seconds. Alone in deep water, with no one nearby to pull him out or slow the bleeding, he had no chance. And the dive that should have ended 20 minutes earlier ended in the worst possible way. Other divers later found his abandoned float, a damaged belt rig, and blood in the water along that section of coast, and alerted authorities once it was clear he was missing. A recovery effort followed. Marine experts who reviewed what happened pointed to a combination of avoidable choices rather than any unusual aggression from the animal: the solo diving, the bleeding catch clipped to his body, and the decision to stay in the water far longer than he needed to. The shark, they noted, had behaved exactly as a great white in those waters would be expected to behave, striking at what looked and smelled like wounded prey. The incident drew brief regional coverage and circulated through the local spearfishing community, where it became a sobering reminder that the warnings everyone had repeated to Trevor were not theoretical. This one stands out because the danger was not hidden in the slightest. Trevor knew the waters held great whites. He had been warned specifically about carrying bleeding fish, and he chose to do it anyway, on a solo dive, well past the point of any sensible exit. He did not misjudge an unfamiliar risk. He repeated a familiar one until it finally caught up with him. It was August 26, 2013, and the peak of the dry season had drawn the Chobe River to its lowest level in years. Wide sandy banks were exposed everywhere, and the remaining channels were packed with concentrated wildlife, including one of the densest populations of Nile crocodiles in all of southern Africa. During the dry season, the concentration of animals along this stretch is genuinely staggering. You can sit at one viewpoint and see elephants, buffalo, crocs, and hippos, all within a few hundred yards. Ketumale Rapitsanyane was a 34-year-old freelance safari guide based in Kasane, Botswana. He'd been guiding along the Chobe riverfront for close to a decade and had a solid reputation with international clients. Experienced and knowledgeable, he had developed a habit of being flexible with safety stuff when accommodating clients, small allowances that had never caused trouble before. Serena Vestergaard was a 42-year-old secondary school teacher from Copenhagen, Denmark, on her first trip to southern Africa. She had hired Rapitsanyane for a private game drive and had specifically asked for riverside stops where she could photograph elephants at the water. It was the kind of request Rapitsanyane had accommodated dozens of times. The morning was productive. They got some good shots of elephant herds and buffalo from the vehicle at several established viewpoints. Around midday, Rapitsanyane parked at a flat, sandy clearing that sloped gently toward the river. It wasn't an official viewing site, just a spot guides sometimes used when the river was calmer. He told Vestergaard she could get out to photograph a group of elephants waiting about 200 yards downstream, but warned her to stay well back from the waterline. He pointed to a rough line in the sand, about 20 yards from the water's edge, and told her not to go past it. Vestergaard set up her tripod roughly 15 yards from the vehicle. Over the next several minutes, she moved progressively closer to the water as the elephants shifted position, each adjustment bringing her a few steps further down the sandy slope. Rapitsanyane was back at the vehicle, messing with gear and dealing with a radio call from another guide. When he looked up, Vestergaard had drifted to about 8 feet from the waterline, her attention entirely focused through her viewfinder. He shouted to her to move back immediately. "I literally went and measured 8 feet in my apartment, and it's basically nothing. It's the distance from my couch to my kitchen counter." She didn't walk to the water on purpose. She just kept adjusting her camera a couple inches at a time, and those inches added up. A large Nile crocodile, estimated later at between 12 and 14 feet, had been lying completely still in the shallows directly in front of her position, its body almost entirely submerged. Only its eyes and nostrils broke the surface, indistinguishable from the mud and debris along the water's edge. Nile crocodiles are Africa's largest freshwater predator, with mature males regularly exceeding 16 feet and weights approaching 1,750 pounds. They've got the strongest bite force of any living animal, over 3,700 pounds per square inch, and their attack is basically a sudden lunge from the water, clamping jaws around whatever they can grab, then dragging the victim into deeper water where the crocodile starts its death roll, a violent spinning maneuver that disorients prey, tears tissue, and ensures drowning. Crocodiles can remain motionless for hours, indistinguishable from the riverbed. The crocodile launched from the shallows in a single explosive movement, covering the short short distance to Vestergaard before she could react to Rapatsignane's warning. Its jaws clamped around her lower left leg, the interlocking teeth penetrating deep into muscle and tissue. The force of the lunge pulled her completely off her feet and toward the water, her camera and tripod scattering across the sand. Rapatsignan sprinted from the vehicle and reached the water's edge as the crocodile dragged Vestergaard into the shallows. He grabbed her arms and pulled, planting his feet in the wet sand. Because the crocodile had launched from extremely shallow water, the struggle kinda stalled at the shoreline for a moment. Vestergaard screaming, the water churning brown around her legs. As the crocodile gained deeper water, it began rotating violently. The force tore her free from Rapatsignane's grip, spinning her body and pulling her fully into the water. The surface churned violently for a while before gradually going still. Rapatsignan stumbled back from the bank and radioed for help. He had her by both arms and was pulling as hard as he could, and the crocodile just took her anyway. Like, what does that do to a person when you're giving everything you've got and it isn't even close to enough? Wildlife authorities arrived within the hour. Partial remains were recovered downstream the following day, consistent with crocodile feeding behavior. The investigation found Rapatsignan had let the client get out and approach the water at a known crocodile-dense location, though he had given her a verbal warning. His guiding license was temporarily suspended during the investigation. No formal charges were filed, but the district issued a regional advisory reinforcing riverbank distance protocols. Her tripod was still standing on the sand when they got there, just sitting in the sun pointing at nothing, and for some reason that image bothers me more than everything else about this one. On August 9, 2016, at a privately operated wildlife facility in Limpopo Province, South Africa, 31-year-old German travel blogger Raffaella Metzger crossed multiple restricted barriers surrounding a leopard enclosure in an attempt to photograph the animal from closer range. Raffaella had been running a small travel blog since her late 20s. Originally from Stuttgart, Germany, she supported herself through part-time remote administrative work while organizing much of her life around long-budget travel. Her content focused less on resorts or tourist landmarks, and more on experiences she described as unfiltered. Wildlife photography became a recurring part of her work, and over time, the distance between herself and the animals she photographed steadily narrowed. By mid-2016, she was traveling through South Africa on a loose backpacking route moving north from the Western Cape toward Limpopo. Through an online travel community, she connected with Peter, a 33-year-old South African familiar with the region, who recommended a lesser-known private wildlife property outside the province's primary tourism corridor. The facility operated under a mixed-use model common among some smaller private wildlife businesses at the time: guided wildlife walks, enclosed predator viewing areas, and supervised interaction sessions involving selected non-dangerous animals. It was not a major accredited zoo, nor a fully open safari reserve. Provincial investigators later described parts of the enclosure infrastructure as older designs built before newer spacing recommendations for apex predator facilities became more standardized. Leopards at the property were not part of any visitor interaction program. The enclosure section housing the leopards included a designated visitor path separated from the predator area by an outer deterrent fence, warning signage, and a marked no-entry zone. Beyond that stood the primary containment perimeter, a reinforced internal enclosure system designed to hold the animals themselves. Maintenance access gates along the primary perimeter were intended for staff use only and remained secured during normal operating hours. Raffaella and Peter arrived at the leopard viewing section late in the afternoon. According to Peter's later statement to provincial authorities, Raffaella initially photographed the leopard from the designated path without incident, but after several minutes, she became frustrated by the angles created by the outer barrier fencing. Peter stated that she moved off the marked path and approached the outer perimeter fence to try to get a cleaner, unobstructed frame of the animal. He told her to come back. She kept moving. Investigators later concluded that Raffaella climbed past the outer visitor barrier and entered the restricted maintenance corridor located between the public viewing boundary and the primary containment perimeter. Physical evidence suggested she then reached an improperly secured maintenance access point connected to the leopard enclosure itself, an access gate staff normally used during feeding and cleaning operations. That gate became the critical point in the entire investigation. Provincial findings later determined the maintenance gate had not latched fully after earlier staff activity that afternoon. The enclosure itself had not structurally failed, but the unsecured access point created a direct opening into the containment zone once Raffaella reached it. Leopards are among the most physically efficient predators in Africa relative to their size. Adult females commonly weigh between 80 and 100 pounds, but their muscle density, acceleration, and explosive striking ability allow them to overpower prey significantly larger than themselves. Unlike lions, which often rely on group behavior, leopards attack alone and at extremely close range. Their Their hunting profile depends on sudden acceleration, rapid control of the upper body, and immediate incapacitation through bites directed at the neck or skull. Even in captivity, habituation to caretakers does not remove these instincts. The leopard housed at the facility was a 7-year-old female that had lived on the property for 4 years. Facility records reviewed after the incident documented no previous aggression towards staff operating within normal feeding and maintenance routines. But behavioral familiarity applies only within recognized patterns. An unfamiliar person suddenly appearing inside the containment boundary outside established routines represents an entirely different stimulus. Peter later told investigators he realized something had gone wrong only after Rafaela disappeared beyond the vegetation line surrounding the maintenance corridor. Seconds later, he heard her scream. He stated that the leopard moved almost instantly. Facility staff reached the enclosure within minutes after Peter ran back toward the office buildings to raise the alarm. The leopard was successfully secured inside an isolation section of the enclosure system before emergency responders entered the containment area. Rafaela Metzger was recovered from inside the primary enclosure zone near the unsecured maintenance access gate. Emergency medical personnel arrived roughly 25 minutes after the initial alarm, but she was pronounced dead before reaching the receiving hospital. The Provincial Department of Nature Conservation conducted a formal investigation into both the facility and the enclosure design. Investigators concluded that Rafaela had deliberately crossed multiple restricted barriers and entered a staff-only containment area not accessible to the public. The primary enclosure structure itself had remained intact throughout the incident. However, the investigation also identified failures in secondary safety procedure, specifically involving the improperly secured maintenance gate and insufficient passive standoff distance between visitor-accessible areas and predator service corridors. The facility was temporarily suspended during the review process and later required to upgrade enclosure spacing, gate security systems, and perimeter separation measures before resuming operations. No action was taken against the leopard, and honestly, that part matters, because this story was never really about an animal escaping containment. The leopard behaved exactly like a leopard inside its own territory. The sequence only became fatal because Rafaela kept moving past every boundary designed to stop a human being from entering that territory in the first place. That's the detail I keep coming back to here. The barriers worked right up until the moment someone decided they no longer applied to them. It was November 14th, 2016, and conditions along the outer reef system off the coast of Queensland, Australia, were calm and clear. Visibility underwater stretched deep between the reefs, surface movement was minimal, and fishing boats had already been operating in the area for hours under steady weather and bright skies. One of the divers that morning was 31-year-old Julian Vane, an athletics coach and experienced freediver who had spent years training himself to stay calm underwater. And honestly, while looking into this case, one thing that stood out was that Julian wasn't reckless at all, and the kind of diver who usually planned everything before getting into the water. That week, Julian had joined a small spearfishing trip along the outer reef system in Queensland. And honestly, the conditions that morning looked almost perfect. Calm water, manageable current, and good visibility. And looking back at the conditions later, it's easy to see why experienced divers in Queensland treat spearfishing very differently from ordinary diving. Julian entered the water with his dive partner Callum Reeves, searching the reef for pelagic fish. During the dive, Julian spotted a large Spanish mackerel about 15 meters down and landed a clean shot, but the fish didn't die instantly. It began thrashing violently against the spear line as Julian started ascending. And this is something a lot of people underestimate about spearfishing in shark territory. Once a wounded fish starts struggling like that, the entire environment changes. The vibrations and sudden movement travel surprisingly well underwater. Julian focused on getting back to the surface while keeping tension on the line. His breathing cycle stayed controlled, and based on Callum's later statement, nothing about Julian's body language suggested panic. He was still swimming normally, but below him, something had already locked onto the movement. Investigators later believed the shark may have been a bull shark or tiger shark, both commonly encountered around Queensland spearfishing areas. Bull sharks are not unusual in those waters. Queensland's reef systems regularly see them moving through the area, especially around spearfishing activity, where injured fish create vibration and blood in the water. Most dives end without any problems, but locals and experienced divers there are very aware that sharks are part of the environment. Callum later said he only noticed a sudden burst of movement under the surface, followed immediately by impact. And within seconds, the entire dive changed. The shark hit Julian once, straight across the torso, with enough force to spin him violently sideways underwater. People imagine shark attacks as these long, chaotic struggles, but this wasn't like that at all. It happened incredibly fast. One sudden impact, one bite. Then the shark let go almost immediately, but that single bite was enough. The bite tore through the left side of his chest and ribs before the shark released almost immediately. Several ribs were fractured on impact, and the damage punctured part of his chest cavity, collapsing one of his lungs. Julian disappeared underwater for a few seconds, and while researching this case, that's the part that really stuck with me. Most real shark attacks are decided in the first seconds, not by strength or fighting back, but by how much damage that first bite causes. Julian somehow made it back to the surface, gasping for air while blood immediately spread through the water around him. Callum reached him within seconds and grabbed onto him before he slipped back under. And this part is hard to picture because Julian was still awake, still trying to breathe, even with that level of damage to his body. The crew pulled him onto the boat as fast as they could while calling emergency services from the reef. At first, some of them thought the wetsuit may have reduced the injuries, but doctors later confirmed it really didn't. The bite had shattered ribs, punctured the chest cavity, collapsed part of his lung, and torn deep into the muscles across his chest and side. Even though the shark let go after a single strike and the crew reacted quickly, the internal injuries were already catastrophic. A rescue helicopter later airlifted him from the reef, but despite emergency treatment and surgery attempts, Julian died from the trauma and blood loss shortly after reaching the hospital. In the weeks after the attack, marine authorities and local dive operators reviewed the safety procedures used around the reef. Several charter companies temporarily suspended open water research dives, while investigators examined weather conditions, bait activity in the area, and how close support vessels were positioned to divers during shark movement. New recommendations were later introduced for research and filming expeditions, including tighter monitoring of shark activity before entry, faster access recovery ladders on support boats, and stricter limits on how far divers could separate from immediate extraction points. Julian's death also reignited debate within the diving community about how unpredictable great white behavior can be, even during controlled professional operations. Some researchers argued that increasing seal activity near the reef may have contributed to heightened predatory behavior in the area, while others pointed out that no safety protocol can completely remove risk once people enter active shark territory. It was February 4th, 2015, when an open-top safari vehicle carrying 6 tourists departed the main gate of a tiger reserve in Madhya Pradesh, central India. The reserve's dense sal forests and bamboo thickets sheltered one of India's densest populations of Bengal tigers, with over 50 individuals tracked within the park's boundaries. Ghislain Mertens was a 44-year-old diamond trader from Antwerp, Belgium, who had traveled to India specifically to photograph Bengal tigers in the wild. Mertens had invested heavily in camera equipment and had booked 4 consecutive morning safaris to maximize his chances of a close sighting. His first 2 drives had produced only distant glimpses, and his impatience was noted by the assigned naturalist guide. The vehicle's driver, a veteran of over 8 years navigating the reserve's network of dirt tracks, operated the diesel vehicle at low speed along a route known for regular tiger activity. Park regulations were non-negotiable. Passengers were forbidden from exiting the vehicle under any circumstances. Standing was prohibited, and all visitors were required to remain seated with limbs inside the vehicle at all times. The guide reiterated these rules before departure. Approximately 90 minutes into the drive, the vehicle rounded a bend and stopped. A tigress lay in a sandy clearing roughly 60 feet from the track, partially concealed by low scrub. The guide noted through binoculars that she was accompanied by 2 cubs, barely visible in the undergrowth beside her. He whispered this information to the passengers and cautioned absolute stillness and silence. Mertens began photographing rapidly, but the angle from his seat placed a branch directly across his frame. He shifted positions twice, then stood from his seat to shoot over the obstruction. The guide pulled him down immediately. The tigress had not reacted, her head resting on her paws, apparently undisturbed. What happened next was pieced together from statements by the 5 other passengers and the guide. Mertens quietly moved toward the rear of the vehicle, swung one leg over the low side panel, and dropped to the ground on the opposite side from the tigress. The guide grabbed for his arm but missed. Mertens moved several paces from the vehicle into the open, apparently attempting to reposition for a clear shot of the tigress and her cubs without the obstructing branches. Bengal tigers are apex predators capable of weighing over 500 pounds, with muscular builds designed for explosive ambush attacks. A tiger can cover short distances at speeds exceeding 35 miles per hour and bring down prey several times its own weight. Tigresses with cubs are among the most dangerous animals in any forest. Their defensive threshold drops dramatically, and perceived threats to offspring trigger immediate violent responses. A tiger's canines can exceed 3 inches, and their claws, capable of disemboweling large prey, make even a single swipe swipe, potentially fatal. The Tigress registered the human figure separating from the vehicle's silhouette. According to passenger accounts, she transitioned from rest to full charge in less than a second. The distance closed before anyone could react. The Tigress struck Mertens from the side with overwhelming force, driving him to the ground. Her jaws closed around his throat and neck, clamping down with a suffocating grip. The driver started the engine and revved it aggressively while the guide and passengers shouted. The Tigress released momentarily as the noise escalated, dropping Mertens and backing away. She held her position between him and the cubs, watching the vehicle, before finally withdrawing into the undergrowth. The guide and passengers pulled Mertens back into the vehicle. He appeared unresponsive from the moment the Tigress released him. The damage to his throat was catastrophic. The vehicle raced toward the park gate, radioing ahead for medical assistance, but Ghislaine Mertens was pronounced dead before reaching the nearest medical facility. Park authorities launched an investigation, confirming through passenger testimony and the guide's account that Mertens had voluntarily exited the vehicle in direct violation of park regulations. The Tigress and her cubs were not harmed. The reserve temporarily suspended safari operations for a safety review before resuming with enhanced enforcement measures. It was March 9th, 2022, at a licensed private exotic animal facility in rural Texas. A keeper had recently acquired 3 chimpanzees. Jason Graham, 48 years old, had spent most of his adult life working around animals. Over the years, he cared for reptiles, parrots, exotic mammals, and various species that most people would never dream of keeping near their homes. His property resembled a zoo, and he enjoyed being known as the person who could handle animals others avoided. Confidence that had begun crossing into overconfidence. The chimpanzees had arrived only days before the incident, and Jason was fascinated by them immediately. Chimpanzees are among our closest living relatives, and their intelligence and human-like expressions often create a false sense of familiarity. People see human-like behaviors and begin believing the animals think like humans. They do not. This is one of the most important lessons in this episode, and it applies far beyond chimpanzees. Recognizing a behavior doesn't mean understanding the motivation behind it. One moment, a chimpanzee appears calm. Moments later, it can turn sharply aggressive. Jason knew their behavior was unpredictable, but still became obsessed with documenting them. Photographs, videos, wanting everyone to see his pets. He forgot that, much like humans, chimpanzees value personal space. From a distance, everything seemed fine, and he interpreted that as friendliness, a dangerous assumption. 2 days after bringing them home, Jason wanted a photograph with them. Taking a picture of an animal usually means respecting its space. Taking a selfie means entering that space yourself. Jason entered the enclosure carrying his phone. Initially, he stayed several yards away. The chimpanzees paid little attention to him. It should have ended there, but he moved closer. And this is how many wildlife incidents begin. Not with one mistake, but with a series of smaller decisions that slowly remove every layer of safety. The chimpanzee closest to Jason began watching him carefully, posture stiffening, attention fixed on him. Jason interpreted this as curiosity rather than a warning sign and kept approaching, eventually crouching down for a selfie, placing himself directly within striking range. Without warning, it lunged. The chimpanzees overwhelmed Jason within seconds. Witnesses described screaming that continued far longer than anyone anticipated, followed by silence. All 3 attacked in turns, biting and tearing in the sustained, relentless way that makes chimpanzee attacks so devastating. By the time responders reached him, he'd suffered severe facial trauma, deep bite wounds, and blood loss too severe to survive. He was still conscious when found, but did not survive to reach surgery. Like other cases in this video, it began when someone repeatedly ignored the boundaries the animal was trying to establish. And by the time Jason realized that, he was already close enough to get killed. What I keep thinking back to with this case is the timeline. He had owned these animals for 48 hours. That is not enough time to understand a chimpanzee, and yet it was all the time it took for familiarity to completely overpower caution.
The morning of June 19, 2014 was bright and dry in Hwange, the great national park in western Zimbabwe, elephant country as much as anywhere in all of Africa. A self-drive vehicle had pulled over on the sand road where a lone bull elephant fed among the trees a short way off, huge and unhurried, tearing branches down with his trunk. Lars Vandenberg was behind the wheel, a Dutch visitor doing the park the independent way, with no guide, his wife beside him, and another couple in the back. He had been hoping the whole trip for a photograph exactly like this one, a big lone bull out in the open with nothing in the frame but the animal itself. Lars was 45, confident, handy with a camera, and completely out of his depth with what he was looking at, though he did not know it. Every rule of a self-drive park comes down to one idea, that you stay in the vehicle and keep your distance, and that a lone bull elephant is very likely the most dangerous thing you will meet all day. The bull in front of them looked calm and slow and entirely peaceful. Lars looked at him and decided the car was in the way of the shot he wanted. He edged the vehicle closer and closer again, until the bull lifted his head from the trees and turned square on, ears spread wide, and stopped feeding. That was the moment to back away slowly and leave the animal alone. Instead, Lars decided he wanted to be in the photograph himself. He put the vehicle in park with the engine still running, told the others he would only be a second, opened his door, and stepped out onto the sand to have his wife take a picture of him standing in front of the bull. A person stepping down out of a vehicle into the open is exactly what a bull elephant reads as a challenge. A small, upright shape that has broken away from the big harmless one and is now standing alone on his ground. He had a wild bull elephant filling his windscreen, and his first instinct was to climb out and stand in front of it for a photo. A bull elephant gives one warning, and most people cannot read it in time: a spread of the ears, a lift of the head, and a hard, unblinking stare. After that warning comes the charge, and a bull can go from standing still to a full run in a stride or two, and is far faster over open ground than any person alive. 10 tons of animal at a dead run does not stop and does not swerve and cannot be outpaced. At close range, on foot, with a vehicle door a few steps away, there is simply nowhere for a person to get to in the time they have. The bull came almost the instant Lars was clear of the door. There was no long bluff charge and no second warning. It dropped its head and drove straight at him across the short stretch of open sand, and Lars turned for the vehicle and managed perhaps a single step. The bull caught him well before he reached the door. It put its head and its tusks down and drove him into the ground. And then it did what an enraged bull does to a thing beneath it, using its trunk and its feet and the whole of its enormous weight over and over in a way a human body is simply not built to survive even once. His wife and the other couple were a few feet away behind thin metal and glass, screaming and helpless, with nothing to do but watch. When the bull was finished, it stood over the place for a long, terrible moment, ears still spread, and then it turned and walked back off into the trees to feed again, as if nothing at all had happened. People see an elephant and think gentle and slow. Up close and out of the car, it is 10 tons that's decided that you are a problem. Lars's wife climbed across into the driver's seat, got the vehicle moving, and drove until she found another car and then, eventually, a ranger, but there had been nothing to be done from the moment the bull committed to the charge. Rangers recovered what there was to recover. The bull was not hunted, because a bull defending his ground from a person who walked up to him on foot has done nothing unusual. The park noted one more self-drive death of the kind that falls most often on people who mistake a calm animal for a safe one. The family was taken home through their embassy.
It was September 21st, 2017, and the Red Sea shimmered under a cloudless sky off the coast of southern Egypt. A local dive operation ran daily boat excursions to offshore reef sites, where drift dives along deep walls offered encounters with pelagic species that rarely appeared closer to shore. Velizar Radev was a 29-year-old dive instructor from Plovdiv, Bulgaria, who had relocated to Egypt 2 years earlier. Radev held advanced certifications and had logged over 2,000 dives across the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Southeast Asia. He served as a senior guide responsible for leading open water excursions and managing client safety during drift dives along the deeper reef systems. The afternoon excursion carried Radev and 4 clients to a reef site approximately 8 miles offshore. The dive boat, captained by Ashraf Gabala, 43, would drop the group at the northern end of a wall and collect them at a designated exit point roughly half a mile south. The plan was routine. The dive proceeded normally for approximately 35 minutes before the group ascended at the exit point. Radev had deployed a delayed surface marker buoy during ascent, but the current and the boat's engine failure had carried the vessel out of position. The group surfaced into open water with no vessel in sight and over 200 feet of blue water beneath them. A commercial fishing vessel had been operating nearby that morning, and traces of bait and fish waste drifted through the area. Radev gathered the group at the surface and deployed an inflatable signal marker. He instructed the clients to stay close together in a tight formation, fins inward, minimizing their profile. The group floated in the open ocean and waited. Oceanic white-tip sharks are among the most dangerous open-water predators encountered by humans, associated with several historical open-water incidents involving survivors adrift in tropical oceans. Adults reach lengths of 10 to 13 feet and weights approaching 370 pounds. Unlike reef-associated species that strike quickly and retreat, oceanic white-tips are persistent, methodical investigators. They approach slowly, circling at distance before closing gradually, investigating potential targets with gentle bumps before escalating to exploratory bites. Their broad, rounded first dorsal fin and long white-tipped pectoral fins make them unmistakable. White tips are solitary and bold, often not deterred by human presence, and they are drawn to irregular surface activity, splashing, and the scent of blood or organic material in the water. Attacks typically follow a prolonged investigation period that can persist for extended periods. The first sign appeared within 20 minutes of the group surfacing. Radev spotted the distinctive white-tipped dorsal fin circling at a distance of roughly 50 yards. The shark was large, an estimated 10 feet, moving in slow, wide arcs. Radev maintained the tight formation and instructed the clients to keep still, avoid splashing, and remain facing the animal. Over the following 40 minutes, the shark tightened its circles steadily, from 50 yards to 30, then 15. It made several close passes, its pectoral fins nearly brushing the diver's fins. On at least 2 occasions, it bumped a client's leg with its snout. Radev maintained eye contact with the animal and, when it came too close, attempted occasional defensive contact against its snout. In some instances, it veered away briefly before resuming its orbit. Approaching an hour in the water, the boat appeared on the horizon. Gabala had repaired the engine and was approaching at speed. As the group began swimming toward the vessel, the tight formation broke apart. Radev, who had been positioning himself between the shark and the clients throughout, found himself several yards behind as the others reached the swim platform. The shark, which had been circling at distance during the boat's approach, moved in decisively. It struck Radev from behind as he turned toward the swim platform, its jaws closing around his lower leg just below the knee. The serrated teeth sheared through muscle and severed major arteries in the lower leg. Radev was briefly pulled downward before resurfacing. Gabala and a deckhand dragged him onto the platform. Within seconds, but severe arterial bleeding was difficult to control with onboard first aid. Radev lost consciousness during the high-speed return to port. He was pronounced dead before the vessel reached the harbor. The investigation noted the engine failure as a major contributing factor that placed the group in open water without boat support, compounded by residual fishing activity nearby that may have contributed to attracting the oceanic white-tip into the area. It was July 19, 2016. And the South African winter had stripped the eastern Cape Bushveld down to its bones. The grass had yellowed and thinned across the rolling hills, the scattered acacia trees standing bare against a pale sky. Visibility out there looked great, or at least that's how it seemed from the road. But the dry season had also exposed these deep drainage gullies cutting across the landscape, their rims lined with dense brown grass tall enough to swallow a crouching animal whole. Wendert Groeneveld was a 64-year-old retired commercial photographer from Bloemfontein who had spent 3 decades shooting wildlife across southern Africa. His work had been published in regional nature magazines, and he pretty much treated every wildlife shoot like a professional assignment, meticulous with his equipment, patient with his subjects, deeply familiar with the rhythms of the bush. The guy had basically made a second career out of sitting in hides and vehicles waiting for the perfect frame. The private game reserve he entered that morning permitted self-drive safari on designated routes, despite the presence of large predators. At the gate, a reserve attendant ran through the standard safety briefing, basically telling guests they were never to exit the vehicle in predator areas. Windows could come down for photography, but doors had to stay shut. Groeneveld signed the waiver and drove through. He spent the morning photographing zebra and giraffe from inside the vehicle using a long lens mounted through the sunroof. The reserve was quiet, barely any other vehicles on the roads, which honestly probably made him feel even more comfortable out there. Shortly after noon, he spotted what he'd been hoping for, a pride of lions resting in open grassland about 80 yards from the road. The pride was just lying there in the mild midday sun, barely moving. Several females lay flat on their sides. Cubs dozed against their mothers. The nearest visible lioness was over 70 yards away, and every animal Groeneveld could see appeared deeply lethargic. The angle from inside the vehicle, though, was blocked by a band of low scrub between the road and the open ground, so to get the shot he wanted, he'd need to mount his heavy tripod on the roof rack, and he couldn't do that from inside. Honestly, if I'm out there and every lion I can see had barely moved for 20 minutes, I genuinely think I might do the same thing, and that's kind of the whole problem with this story. Groeneveld had gotten out of his vehicle at other reserves before, always in areas without big predators around. That habit, plus the pride looking half asleep, plus the distance, it all added up to a decision that felt totally rational in the moment. He opened the door, stepped down to the ground, and moved to the rear to retrieve the tripod. What Groeneveld couldn't see, and honestly what would have been super difficult for anyone to spot from road level, was a lone lioness from the same pride lying in a shallow drainage ditch about 30 yards from the road. The tall grass along the ditch rim concealed her completely. She had separated from the group earlier and had been resting in the shade of the gully. African lions are the continent's apex terrestrial predator, with adult females weighing between 280 and 400 pounds. Lionesses are the pride's primary hunters, relying on concealment and short explosive charges. A lioness can hit roughly 35 miles per hour in short bursts, covering distances that look totally safe in seconds. Lionesses can become highly defensive when humans appear near cubs. Groeneveld was positioning the tripod legs against the roof rack when the lioness charged from the drainage ditch, 30 yards with almost no obstacle between them. The charge covered the distance so fast there would have been pretty much zero warning. He never reached the vehicle door. Based on tracks and body position, rangers later theorized the lioness likely struck him from the side, driving him to the ground. Injuries were consistent with a crushing bite to the neck and upper spine. Groeneveld's struggle appeared to have been brief. The lioness pulled him several feet from where he fell before releasing. She retreated toward the drainage ditch as the rest of the pride stirred in response to the commotion but did not approach the road. Midday traffic on the secondary loop roads was pretty sparse during winter. Another self-drive visitor discovered Groeneveld's vehicle about 2 hours later, door hanging open, tripod on the ground beside the rear wheel, camera bag still in the cargo area. Rangers recovered the body a short distance from the road. Scene evidence basically suggested he'd gotten out on his own. The reserve issued a public statement reaffirming its vehicle exit prohibition in predator zones. That tripod sitting in the dirt next to the rear tire, he put it there to set up a shot and never picked it back up, 2 hours before anybody even drove past.